The dust came off the county road in ribbons, pale as breath, and carried with it the mineral tang of a sky that hadn't broken rain in 92 days. Larkland Shaw felt grit salt her tongue as she stood with the others beside the cattle pens at Hopkins' auction, the brim of her hat low, the late heat of August pressing on her shoulders the way bad news presses on a chest. Her family, ranchers with hands like knotted rope and stubbornness older than the fences, had gathered to sell 3 more steers to make the note at the bank less like a noose. You couldn't tell pride from worry on a Shaw man's face unless you were born watching both, and Larkland had been. "Don't wander," Aunt Mavis told her, which was to say, don't go looking for a reason to hope. Hope got you hurt more sure than a mean bull. Larkland nodded and watched dust move. The earth in Clement County had a way of showing you exactly how much it wanted to keep what little it had. Even the cottonwoods looked tired, their leaves turned sideways, flashing a dull pallor in the wind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you. Down beyond the pens, behind a table of chipped enamel mugs and a box of rusted hinges, an iron thing caught her eye. It was a C-wrecked kind of chest, banded and riveted, pitted by time until it looked more like a relic than a box, something salvaged from the belly of a storm. The latch was a lion's head with no teeth left. It wore its age with the shamelessness of a scar. She felt it look at her and felt, unnervingly, looked back at by it. "Don't," Mavis murmured without looking. "We ain't buying conversation starters." "I wasn't—" Larkland started and stopped because she was. She wanted to know what it had held and how far it had traveled to get all the way here, to this square of dirt between a feed store with a sagging sign and an auction house with a dreadfully spry auctioneer. A man stepped into the heat haze and set his hand on that chest. Not a Shaw, no hat crease like theirs, no sunburn map like theirs. He was taller than the men clustered in the shade by the hitching rail, not broad so much as spare, built like something that had missed meals in order to think more. His shirt sleeves were rolled, revealing forearms cross-hatched with burns and a long, pale line that spoke of solder and stubbornness both. His eyes were the color of creek beds when there is no creek. "Don't you dare," Cousin Lynn drawled, spot on to the side, his voice coming in a lazy hook Larkland had learned to duck. "Don't you bid our feed money on some sailor's trunk, whoever you are." The man didn't look. He knelt, testing the hinges, the weight, the balance. He tapped the lid. The iron chest answered in 2 tones, a hollow ring and a dull clank, as if it had more than one story inside it. The auctioneer rose and fell in the way of summer, a choir of numbers. Cattle went first, a lot of sighing at the hammer. A windmill head with one good blade went next. Then the iron chest rolled forward on a dolly that squealed like a pig. The auctioneer's voice changed, instinctively amused. "Lot 92, barn find," he loved the taste of that phrase. "Iron chest, riveted bands, unknown origin, as is." "Started at 10, someone barked. 5, someone else corrected, to a ripple of laughter. Larkland, who knew the difference between rust that was finished and rust that was beginning to tell you something, felt the fat sleep of the crowd. It would go cheap. It looked like a thing that had already confessed its mistakes. The spare man's hand lifted. 5, he said, making it sound like an oath. 5 I have, sang the auctioneer. 550, said Lynn, grinning over his shoulder at the Shaw men, already savoring the joke he was building. Lynn liked to set a fire and then argue with the smoke. Mavis's elbow found Larkland's ribs. "Don't." But it wasn't Larkland's arm that rose. It was the stranger's again. 7. 750. 8. 850. The stranger glanced, not at Lin, but at the horizon, like he'd asked it what his number should be, and the horizon had answered without moving. 10. Now the laughter was open. $10, the auctioneer roared, as if it were 10,000. We got a believer. Len whistled. We got a fool. Mavis's mouth pinched down so hard it swallowed a word, but it wasn't fool. Larklin heard it anyway. Hunger. They couldn't afford arrogance. They couldn't afford delight. They could barely afford the feed sacks tied with blue string that kept their calves on the right side of maybe. 10 once, 10 twice, sold! The stranger paid in folded bills that looked like they had spent 1,000 miles learning how to be paper, and bent to lift the chest as if he'd been waiting to touch it for a long time. That's when the Shaw men laughed. Not the kind of laughter that follows a joke down the porch steps and sits with it a while. The quick kind. The brittle kind that uses its teeth. Hey, Professor, you gonna teach that box to plow? Maybe it'll weep whiskey. We could use that, another cousin said. Mavis didn't laugh. She watched the stranger like she watched the sky, wary, measuring, bargaining with it inside her head in case it held rain. Larklin moved without deciding to, stepping into the cruel little theater like someone who couldn't abide a theater at all. If you're set on hurting something, she said, quietly enough that a person would have to lean into their better nature to hear her, hurt me. Leave him be. Them's fightin' words, Len said, amused. They're tired words, she said. Same ones you use every Saturday since forever. Maybe try new ones. The stranger finally looked at her. The creek-bed eyes held neither apology nor thanks. They held notice. He saw her, and Larklin felt seen in a way that made her aware of her posture, the weight distribution in her boots, the scrape of a chicken wire cut on her thumb that should have healed but hadn't. I can manage the lift, he said, voice like a file run once across steel. But I could use a set of hands that know when to let go. You'll get splinters, Len warned, as if he were the guardian of splinters and the world was irresponsible. I'm acquainted, Larklin said. She took hold of the far handle. The iron was sun-hot. Heat went through her glove anyway. They counted without saying the numbers and raised it from the dolly. God, it was heavier than its size suggested, and started a slow, balanced walk toward the road shoulder, where an old flatbed sat hitched to a blue truck that had seen more weather than mercy. What's your name? She asked, because a chest like that asked for a name to anchor against. Hale. Jonah. Larklin, she replied, and heard behind them her relatives make a whole act of Larklin, as if her mother had done them dirty by not choosing Mary or June. Jonah's hand adjusted. The weight changed. She changed with it. They placed the chest on the flatbed, and Larklin anchored it with a length of rope that she had cut herself that morning from a coil that smelled of decisions. Every tool does. You're building something, she said, half a question and wholly an accusation, because if he was, then the auction day had just changed shape in her mind. Always, Jonah said. He stepped back and looked at what they'd done as if anything that stayed the same too long offended him. Out of that? Len asked. He had followed as far as the shade line, unwilling to step out of it. You'll be building disappointment. Jonah turned once, slowly, and Larklin saw that he was not a man who rushed any measurement. You ever watch a windmill that can't find wind? We watch cows that can't find water, Len said, sharper. Then you know where the problem is. His gaze moved to the horizon again, to the parched, faint line where the earth promised sky and then didn't deliver. Heat is a cruelty, but it is also a force. Larklin felt her skin pull tight with a sensation that sat between irritation and curiosity. What kind of force? She asked. A stubborn one, Jonas said. The kind that keeps trying to lift even what we bury. She thought he was talking about water. She hoped he was talking about water.
in a county where men kept their hats on at the dinner table because taking them off felt too much like asking for a blessing. Water governed everything. Dignity, debt, whether a calf stood up or lay down and didn't. Hope was a contraband commodity. A person could be arrested by it and sit in a cell the rest of their life. "Where's home?" she asked. He made a quiet sound that wasn't a laugh. "The last place I left." Which was? West and down a ways. That was either a joke or a kind of prayer. She couldn't tell yet which kind of man he was, the kind that used both of those to keep people where he needed them, or the kind that used both of those to keep himself from breaking. "We can haul for you," she heard herself say, because she had a truck, and there was a part of a person that wants to be useful to danger when it looks like genius in dirty clothes. We who?" Len said. "Us," she said, climbing up into the cab without asking if he had someone else to do the driving, "or the chest stays right here and you pay me storage by breathing near it."
Jonah accepted the terms by climbing into the passenger side, placing his hands on his knees like a polite trespasser. He didn't smell like most men at auction, chew and brag and the flash of fresh aftershave that told on a man harder than drink ever did. He smelled like flux, like cedar shaving and miscalculation. He smelled like staying up when other people went to bed. It put a heat in her face that wasn't sun. They were half a mile down County 14 before Len's catcalls faded behind them and the road noise became the kind that allowed thought to move without tripping. Jonah watched the fields pass with an appraisal that wasn't contempt. His attention didn't snag on the ruins of old machinery the way a pessimist's would, or on the green strip irrigated by a neighbor's well the way a thief's would. He was collecting the way a person collects when they're honest about how much they can carry and careful about where they set it down. "You don't talk much," Larklin observed. "Words are expensive in a drought," he said. "I try not to spend more than the sky does." "You already spent $10 on a box that'll probably fall apart the day you look at it with your worst thought." "Then I'll change my worst thought," he said, and the faintest unadvertised smile touched one side of his mouth. She stored that away with the smells, with the burn scar, with the way his boots made a precise sound on the truck's floorboard, like he placed himself on purpose in all things. They turned down the long dirt lane that led to the Shaw's spread, where the wind carried the constant soft clacking of a broken slat on the north barn. The sound had been the backdrop of Larklin's summer, like a metronome for worry. Mavis met them at the yard fence, hands on hips, every ring on her right hand gleaming like it had something it wished to say about the world, and the world had best listen. The men hung back. Shaw men always let their women take the first round. It made them feel measured and brave without having to be either. "I am going to count to 1, and when I am done counting, you will tell me why what I told you not to do is now in our yard, on our time, using our gas." Larklin put the truck in park. She pressed her palms to the wheel. She looked at the house, the paint flaking the way a snake sheds but forgets to leave, and she said, "Because this is a person who knows things we need." "Like what?" Mavis said. "Like how heat is a force," Larklin said, and heard how much it sounded like she was selling a miracle she couldn't even describe. Mavis turned those rings toward Jonah. "That right?" He didn't nod. Jonah did not move unless he meant to. "Yes, ma'am." "Show me," Mavis said. If she had been a general, the county would have been quieter. Jonah slid out of the truck. He tapped the chest as if to wake it. He looked around the yard, measured the arc of the sun with his eyes only, and walked to the shop where Larklin kept the tools her father had left when he put a shotgun in the truck and never brought it back. It was a neat shop, not because of grief, but because of use. Grief makes a person throw things. Use makes a person put them back where they can be found in a hurry. He asked for a hand cart, a sledge, and a willingness to sweat. He got 2 of the 3. Larklin put her shoulder under the 3rd. They pried the chest open. It didn't scream, it sighed. Dust rose and then cleared to reveal what Larklin had half feared and half wanted, emptiness. But not the lazy kind.
The interior had been lined long ago with a different metal than the body, something that had once been bright as a choir robe and now wore the faint chemistry stains of a life spent near salt. The base wasn't a flat panel, but a shallow curve, as if the chest wanted to hold liquid like a kindness. In each corner someone had drilled and then plugged a small, careful hole. Jonah ran his fingers along the plugs. He listened with the pads of his fingers, and she knew that kind of listening because she did it to fence wire and the soft hair by a calf's jaw, to engines and to people. She recognized it and felt protective of it. "This was a condenser once," he said. "Which is what?" Mavis asked. "An instrument that convinces hot things to forget themselves and then gives the cold thing back." "Water," Larklin translated, breathing despite herself. "Yes," he said, "if we ask it right, if we ask the air, if we ask the sun." He touched the lion's toothless mouth. "If we ask it not to be beautiful and be useful instead." "You fixin' to pull water out of a sky that forgot it?" Mavis said, and there was a chuckle under the skepticism that Larklin would have climbed a windmill to hear again. It meant Mavis had not surrendered the part of her that liked audacity. "All right. You can stay here 2 days. You don't cost us more than you bring. You don't use our last welding rods unless you show me how to make more from the extra. And you don't let that truck of hers go anywhere but here and the feed store. And you don't let those boys anywhere near a torch." "Them boys been using torches since," Len protested. "Since they found one in a movie they weren't supposed to be watching." "Hush." Jonah inclined his head. "Yes, ma'am." He drew on the workbench in charcoal. He drew not like a man who wanted to impress, but like one who wanted to remember. Lines and arcs, a frame of pipe, a tall skeletal tower of scavenged metal braced in triangles because triangles take offense at collapse. He labeled nothing. He pointed with his knuckle. "He needs height and we need surface. The night will give us back what the day steals if we tell it to. The chest, she will be the cool. Above her, his hand rose, sketched a canopy. We place the hot." "Skin?" Larklin asked, imagining canvas. "Tin," he said, "or 1,000 beer cans opened and rolled flat." Mavis grunted. "Lord knows this county has enough of those." He spoke in verbs that made nouns move. Solder, rivet, brace, wick. He cut the air with his hand where pipes would run. He marked the ground with his boot heel where posts would set. When he looked at Larklin, it wasn't to assign her the easy tasks. He said, "I need you to decide what we can spare." "Spare is a lie we tell ourselves to feel generous," Larklin said. "We don't have spare, we have trade." "Then trade me steel that has not yet decided what it prefers to be, and I'll give it new preferences." Which is how, under a sky that refused sensible compromise, they began. Larklin fetched and measured and cut. Jonah braced and lifted and thought out loud just enough that she could see inside the arithmetic. He made the ranch, reluctantly at first, into a scrap map. A gate sacrificed its hinge for a pivot. An old branding rack donated a crossbar. The broken plow by the south fence yielded a plate that cleaned up nicer than it had a right to. The chest waited in the shade like a patient old animal used to being useful and not being asked if it minded. By sundown, they had a frame that, if you squinted, looked like a wind harp wrong about its own song. Larklin's shirt clung where sweat clings. Jonah's hair dampened the same way a man's hair dampens when he is near a fire he made on purpose. From the yard fence, the men performed observances. "You two buildin' a gallows?" Len asked, spit perfect. "If we were," Larklin said, "you'd be the first to test the platform." A few of the cousins laughed then, real, because it was a good line, and because there is a point in the day when even cynics get tired of their own echo. Len smiled around it, and, like he always did when faced with a wall he couldn't talk across, changed the subject to his favorite, debt. Bank called, Lark, wants their interest. Says drought or no, a note is a note. I know what a note is, she said. I also know what a well is. You better, he said, nodding at the skeleton in the yard, because you're gambling ours. After the men drifted back to card games and complaint, after Aunt Mavis set a pot of beans on the stove and made bread that tasted like memory of rain, Larklin and Jonah worked by lantern. Moths battered themselves against glass because a thing that knows only one truth keeps slamming itself into it until the truth breaks or the thing does. "Why did you come here?" Larkland asked, copper wire bright in her hands. "Because you looked at the chest like it wasn't just a dead thing," Jonah said. He crimped and twisted, his hands confident and careful, and Larkland thought, he has made mistakes that taught him not to hurry, and he listened when they lectured. And if I hadn't? I would have gone south, somewhere with fog to teach. You talk like weather is a language. He paused, stripped a wire with his teeth in a brutality that wasn't. It is, he said, and most of us are illiterate. They made 2 more braces and a cradle for the chest that would tip the slightest bit when weight shifted, the way a good hand learns the difference between a calf that's playing and a calf that's about to kick. She admired the geometry of it without saying so. Praise is a commodity rarer than water in some families. You hoard it and spend it at funerals. Near sundown, the tower's ribs stood like an unfinished psalm. Mavis stepped out on the porch and watched, arms crossed against a breeze that pretended to be kind. "It looks like something that knows what it's doing," she said. "It will," Jonah answered, so quietly Larkland almost didn't hear him. "Don't make promises with my yard," Mavis said, but there was no bite in it. "Come in and eat." They did. At the table, under the whistle of the bad kitchen fan, Larkland watched her aunt watch Jonah. Mavis could sit a man down with nothing but her attention. She turned it now, like a lamp, looking for what could be sterilized and what had to be cut away in the dark. "You married?" she asked, the way one asks if a horse has ever bucked hard enough to break itself. "No," Jonah said. "Ever?" "No." "You planning to be?" Planning is a generous word. Honest is a rarer one. She passed the beans and said nothing more, which was the whole cross-examination and the verdict at once. When the house had quieted, when the cousins' laughter thinned and the lamp over the card table went dark, Larkland and Jonah went back to the yard. The night, finally free of shouting, made a different set of sounds. Coyotes miles off, corn leaves ticking against one another like soft glass, a chain clinking once when the wind remembered it. They set the chest into its cradle, and Larkland felt something hitch under her ribs she didn't want to name. "Sometimes I think the county is a throat that forgot how to swallow," she said. "Then we'll teach it," Jonah said. They bolted the tin skin panels to the top frame in overlapping scales. The lantern light made the metal seem to move. When the skin was complete, the tower looked like a strange flower that had decided it'd rather be an instrument. "What do you call it?" Larkland asked. "If it works," Jonah said, "we'll call it good. And if it doesn't, we'll call it tomorrow." He tilted the panel edge with his palm and listened to the sound it made against the bracing. Tin sings when you ask. It tells you where it wants fasteners. Does everything talk to you? She asked, half tease, half test. Only the stubborn things, he said, and smiled that unadvertised half-smile again. It was the kind of night that teaches your muscles new names for themselves. Larkland felt the work settle into her shoulders as a clean ache. She felt useful. The world, so given to telling her what she wasn't, soft enough, quiet enough, enough of anyone's idea of enough, shrank to the square of yard where she and a stranger asked it for a different answer. Near dawn, the tower stood. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't supposed to be. The chest rested in its cradle beneath the tin canopy. Coils of copper snaked from the canopy's edges, down through a pipe Jonah had cut and threaded, and into the chest through the plugs he had drilled out and resealed with fittings that made the whole thing look like a lung that had finally decided breathing had a point. "We prime at sunset," Jonah said. "Temperature delta will do most of the work if the night is honest." "Is the night ever honest?" Larkland asked. "More often than we are."
He rolled his shoulders once, like a man putting a day down and asking the next one to be no worse. Larkland watched his hands, hands that had obviously broken more than once, then learned how not to. She went inside, slept on sheets that had known dust as a roommate all summer, and woke to Mavis's knuckles on the door jamb. "Bank called again." "I know," Larkland said, "because there are certain sentences you begin to hear as weather rather than words." "You plan to answer them?" "Yes," Larkland said, "this evening." "Lord help us," Mavis muttered, but she kissed Larkland's forehead like a benediction you give a soldier, and went to stand at the kitchen window, where the tower made the yard look like a place more interesting than required. Day was cruel. It pretended not to notice hope set up in its sunlight. The cousins littered the shade with commentary. "Tin flower," one named it. "Idiot tree," another corrected. Len, of course, had to make it personal. "Log's folly," he declared, and the boys laughed the way boys laugh when they think they have invented the meanness they inherited. Larkland did not answer. She fed the cats. She greased the pump at the east fence so it wouldn't seize if it ever saw water again. She made sure the hoses Jonah had asked for were clean and didn't smell of old diesel. She worked because working is the language people like her learned in place of wringing hands. Shortly before sunset, Jonah climbed the tower with the bucket he'd kept covered all day. He removed the cover with reverence and began to paint the underside of the tin with a black slurry that smelled faintly of molasses and salt. "What is that?" Len called. "Night," Jonah said, and kept painting. "Like hell it is," Len said, but he said it more quietly. He finished as the sun did. The sky tipped from brass to copper to iron. Heat loosened its fist by degrees. The tower knew, the way a thing knows when the hands that built it have begun the last part of their prayer. Jonah climbed down. He and Larkland positioned the chest's outflow spout above a waiting basin, an old enamel tub with a crack she'd sealed with patience and an epoxy that had no patience for mistakes. He checked the seals. He checked the copper coils as one checks a trail before stepping onto it. He placed his palm on the chest's flank. It felt like the back of a horse, calming itself. "Now?" Larkland asked, breath making her voice smaller than she intended. "Now we wait," he said. Mavis came out and stood with them. She didn't bring chairs. You don't sit down when you're teaching the night its chores. The tin whispered first. It creaked the way a thing does when the temperature decides to go someplace else with its life. The black slurry drank light faster than the day could release it. A subtle exhale moved through the tower. The air under the canopy cooled, and where it cooled, it brought out of itself tiny beads. At the margins, the copper lines gathered those beads like women gathering gossip, pulled them along where pitch and angle conspired for their journey, and sent them downward, down to the chest where the old rivets remembered a time they had not been lonely.
Larklin put her ear to the chest. She heard it then, the lightest sound, like small bones learning how to belong. Water. Not a flood, not a promise, a beginning. She closed her eyes, immediately opened them, embarrassed by the tenderness of wanting. "Don't you cry," Mavis said, but the grit in her voice had loosened. "It's water, Aunt," Larklin said. "It's a machine," Mavis said, but she stood closer. The outflow spout darkened. Drops formed that couldn't stop themselves, then a thread, then with all the drama of a new foal deciding that legs will do, a trickle. The men fell silent. Larklin had never heard them without their sentences like armor. She wanted to turn and look, to hold their faces accountable to this quiet, but she didn't. She held her breath and watched the thread become a string, become a small, consistent ribbon that carried itself into the enamel basin with a sound so soft she wanted to kneel. Jonah didn't smile. He exhaled, and in that exhale Larklin heard what he'd held all day, the exact weight of not quite believing anything until it was in his hands. "That's—" Mavis started and stopped because some words earn their way to a mouth and others have to wait in the hall. Larklin dipped her fingers into the basin. The water was cool and had that new taste some waters have, as if they were surprised to find themselves in the world. She held her wet fingers up for Mavis, who bent and took one into her mouth as if it were medicine. "Lord," Mavis said, and meant the name. At the fence, Len muttered, "Trick!" but even his voice could not find purchase. The trickle grew. The copper sang touch songs to itself as the droplets ran. The chest did what it had been asked to do back when it belonged to the belly of a wrecked ship or the corner of a field where someone had more need than sense. The enamel basin began, incredibly, to think about overflow. "Buckets," Larklin said, and ran, legs arguing with one another in a way that made her laugh and nearly fall, because relief can make a body more drunk than any bottle. She fetched every vessel that would hold a gift, pails, mason jars, the blue cooler with the broken latch. They filled them. They kept filling them. 10 minutes of ribboned water, it felt disrespectful to call it a stream, became 20, became 30. The night cooled its hands. The tower gave the night a reason. The chest remembered the ocean and forgave it. They worked by lantern again, but the light was different. It had something to hang on to that wasn't fear. "Tomorrow," Jonah said low for her alone, as they moved the full jars away from the ankles of accident. "We add more surface, we smear more night, we tighten the seals, we feed it back some of its own. It will learn us as we learn it." "What do we give it?" Larklin asked.
"Attention," he said, "and stubbornness, and whatever spare will we pretended we had left." She almost reached for his hand in the way one reaches for a fence post during a fever. Instead, she steadied a pail. The cousins began to drift home, their silhouettes less certain of themselves than she had ever seen them. Mavis left the porch light burning the way lighthouse keepers do when they hope for answers and dread the way they arrive. Jonah checked the chest as a doctor checks a pulse, and eventually sat on the flatbed's tail with his elbows on his knees and his head tipped like a tired saint. Larklin carried the last full jar into the kitchen and set it on the counter beside the sink that had squeaked dry all summer. She thought of the bank. She thought of notes and nooses. She thought of bringing a mason jar of honest-to-God water to a man who spoke interest like a second language and asking him if he'd like to learn a better one. She turned, and the screen door jitter-shook on its tired spring. On the porch, Len leaned against the post that had never done anything to him. There was a smell on him she recognized, spite with a chaser of confusion. "You think you're a hero," he said. "No, I think I have hands." "You brought a stray with a toolbox into our yard," he said. "You let him bolt his contraption to our breath, and now you think he belongs." "Belonging is earned," she said evenly. "Watch him." Len's jaw set. "Men like that take everything they touch apart."
Men like that put some things back together, she said. The difference is whether you're looking. He stepped into her space because men like Len forget distance when their words fail. You bring him into our house, you'll what? Mavis said from the kitchen doorway, and the edge in her voice cut the sentence into a handful of harmless letters. You'll go to bed. You'll wake up early, you'll fix the south fence, and if you mouth off to me again in my kitchen, I will show you every way you are not yet grown. Len had never been good at being dismissed. He wanted wars that stayed as long as his anger. He reached toward the table where the full jars waited like miracles, and with a flick of his wrist that he pretended was carelessness but was calculation, he knocked the first one to the floor. It shattered, the water spread, gleaming on old linoleum, and Larklyn heard a sound leave her throat that wasn't a cry and wasn't a word, and had in it a childhood. Mavis's hand shot out. She gripped Len's shirt at the collar and dragged his face down with a calm strength that comes from picking up calves and burdens for a half a life. You can hate your own confusion in the yard, she said intimately into his flinch. Not in my kitchen. She let him go. He went, shoulders making a counterfeit of pride. The screen door tried to pretend it was a thunderstorm. They mopped, they laughed, brittle at first, then quiet. Larklyn set the shards of glass in a cardboard box like bones you plan to bury when the ground is ready for funerals again. Outside, the tower kept doing its one thing. In the yard light, it looked purposeful to the point of rude. Jonah was not where she'd left him. She found him at the fence line, looking toward the north pasture, where the old stone ring of Shaw Wells sat like a memory that had cost more than it had paid. "You think we can wake it?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "Maybe, if we teach the ground to listen." "How?" "We draw its ear down," he said, pointing to where the tower's pipe ran toward the chest. "We give it something to drink from that is not only itself. We coax it with the idea of plenty." "Like rumor." "Exactly." He smiled not at her, but near her, as if her mind had stepped into a light he respected. The night settled. The tower sang its tin song. The chest thunked softly as droplets announced their arrival like good visitors. Around 2 in the morning, when even men who hate sleep give up and take some, Larklyn and Jonah moved the first full blue cooler of water toward the old well to pour it slow, to tell the ground a new story. The cooler was a weight 2 people wanted, but it argued. The handle pinned Larklyn's knuckles and she hissed. Jonah shifted to take more than his share without making a sermon about it. They reached the stone ring. Larklyn's lamp made the stones look wet in places. It was a lie, but it was a pretty one. She set the cooler down. Jonah levered the lid. Cold air breathed out. Blessed, impossible. Larklyn braced the edge on the well's wall and tipped. A ribbon of water arced, caught the lamplight, and fell, the sound a bright coin tumbling in the throat of the earth. They both bent instinctively to listen. 3 seconds. 4. 5. Then a faraway splash. Not bottomless. Not yet. "We'll feed it slow," he said. "We'll not shock it with what it forgot." He wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist, as if he had just eaten something salty he needed to keep. They poured again, and again. They rested their hands on old stone between pourings. Larklyn felt the ground under her boots, as if the county had feet, and hers had found them. A sound cut the darkness then. Not coyote, not wind. A low metallic yelp from the yard, followed by the ragged stutter of something big deciding to be bigger. "The braces," he said, already running. "The west brace." Larklyn was right behind, the lamp's flame throwing wild guesses at the grass. At the tower, the west brace had buckled at the footplate. Some idiot had kicked at the base bolts. Len's boots printed in the turned dirt like a confession, and the wind had taken the invitation. The whole canopy had skewed 5 degrees, enough to drag the copper coil half out of its seat and torque the line that fed the chest. The thread of water hiccuped, then thinned to nothing. Jonah caught the leg with both arms and a sound like something from an old battle. The tower answered by groaning enough to make Larkland taste iron. "Get the jack," he said, teeth set. "Under the joint. Hurry." She sprinted for the shop, hands reaching before the door even remembered it was supposed to be shut at night. The floor was suddenly a landscape of hazards. She found the farm jack by the vise and hefted it with a grunt that tore loose her careful quiet. Back at the tower, Jonah's arms shook. The canopy shuddered like a bird trying not to fall asleep and losing.
She set the jack. She pumped. Each ratcheting lift was a curse offered to physics. The leg rose into the jack's iron palm. Jonah slid his shoulder out and his hand in and pushed the bolt back through the plate with the entire argument of his body. "Wrench," he said. She had it ready. He tightened, jaw standing out the way mountains do. The leg settled back. The tower found its old idea of itself again and checked its own weight with suspicious care. Larkland blew a breath that left her thinner and more certain. "He did that," she said. No need to say the name. Jonah didn't look toward the bunkhouse where Len slept. He looked up, along the pipes, to the canopy, to the coil. "We'll weather it," he said, "but he won't like how we decide to." They reseated the copper. They soothed the tin with fresh pitch along one seam that had thought about quitting. The chest coughed once, decided it would forgive them, and began again its patient lesson. Water found the path it had made for itself and loved it enough to repeat it. The eastern horizon thought about light with the same reluctance as men think about apologies. Larkland felt every cell in her palm say it was time to stop, then heard the county say it wasn't. She straightened slowly. Jonah stepped back to study the tower as if it were something he had met and would now have to learn how to be friends with. Mavis's voice came from the porch like a trumpet played under a blanket. "Phone," she called. "Larkland?" Larkland wiped her hands on her jeans, left mud that would not be ordinary to wash off, and walked into the kitchen where the long cord of the wall phone made an umbilical to a world she sometimes wished had been born kinder. "Miss Shaw?" The voice was a man's, thin with importance. "I am Edmund Vance, First Clement." "I know who you are," she said. "I am calling as a courtesy," he said, and the word courtesy sounded on his tongue like a coin someone else had earned. "Your payment is 12 days late. I am in the county today. I can be at your property in 20 minutes. It would be best if you were prepared to show good faith." "We have water," Larkland said, and had the savage delight of hearing his pause then in turn. "Pardon?" "We have water," she said again, lower, like a secret and a threat. "If you come in 20 minutes, I'll give you a glass. You can count it against principle." "Miss Shaw," he laughed, the way men laugh when they aren't paid to understand. "I'm not thirsty." "Then you shouldn't come thirsty," she said, and hung up because she could. Jonah was at the threshold, listening not to be a spy, but to be ready. She met his eyes. 20 minutes, she said. "For what?" "For judgment." She swallowed. "For spectacle. For everything that goes wrong when you bring a banker to a miracle." They walked out together. The yard had a new smell. Tin warmed once and cooling. Copper after rain with no rain. Pride when it is trying very hard to pretend to be prudence. The tower whispered its prayer. The chest answered with its pulse. The enamel basin overran with the casual obscenity of abundance. A dust plume announced Edmund Vance in 15. He drove a manufactured car that looked like liability had invented it. He wore a suit the color of iced tea and a tie that was a way to tell the county he kept a distance from it on purpose. He stepped out as if the ground might stain him, and then, hating himself for it, looked for a place to put his city souls. "Miss Shaw?" he said, crisp in the way a new dollar is crisp. He saw Jonah and filed him as a complication to be managed later. He saw the tower and arranged his features into something like polite disapproval. "I see you've acquired lawn art." "Come here," she said. Bankers like to be asked, not told. "Pardon?" "Come here," she repeated. And because there was something in her voice that reminded him of a mother he had once respected and then had tried to forget, he came. She put the enamel basin in his hands. She held it in the kind of way that made heavy things light, and then let him find the weight. He did, and almost dropped it. His shoes suffered. His tie decided to consider the wind. "What is this?" he demanded, as if a rhetorical question could stop a physical fact from being one. "Payment," Larklin said, "in the only currency the county respects." He stared down at the water wringing the blue-chipped basin. It was clear as anything that had ever made a promise and kept it. "How?" he asked, and there was a child in that syllable he would never have admitted to owning. Jonah, at her shoulder, waited for her to choose her words. She did. "We asked the night for what it stole from the day, and it gave it back."
The old well vomited air first, a coughing gust that smelled of limestone and years. Then a rattle like a chain dragged up a throat. Larklin's boots scraped for anything that remembered being ground. The world tilted her toward the dark. Her shoulder screamed where the stone kissed bone. Jonah's hands were a vice on her wrist. A second hand, unexpected, manicured, uncalloused, found Jonah's collar and hauled as if paper had found a spine. Edmund Vance, panting like a boy who had never worked for breath before, flinched and didn't let go. The top course of stones slid another inch. Grit avalanched into the mouth. Larklin felt time thin to a brittle thread. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. "Kick!" Jonah barked, a word with every muscle in it. Larklin obeyed. The toe of her boot found a lip inside, a miracle of friction and instinct. She shoved herself up against Jonah's pull. Vance swore, something old-fashioned and ashamed of itself, and pulled like a man trying to remember a lesson he'd skipped. The world bucked again. Then she was on the stones, belly scraped, hair full of dust, her hat gone into the county's memory. They rolled back together as the well took one more breath, like a beast that had finally made up its mind. The top stones settled with a groan. A low roar climbed out of the shaft, followed by a sound no one in Clement County had heard with their own ears in a year: the slap of water against stone. Mavis reached them at a run she didn't advertise anymore. She hauled Larklin to her feet and went for Jonah with the other hand by reflex. Vance sat down hard on the dirt and stared at his palms like they had betrayed him by being useful. The well breathed again. Then, with a cool eddy that lifted the hair on Larklin's arms, water rose, not a geyser, not a fairy tale, but the steady, angry insistence of something denied too long. It wetted the lowest stones. It licked higher. It stopped as if considering, then held a dark, trembling disk 8 feet down, bright where the lamplight found it. Len arrived late, red-faced and swearing, and skidded to a halt when the air from the well cooled his shinbones. He looked from the water to Larklin to Jonah to Vance, and something squeezed sour in his mouth. "You feed it," he accused, voice ragged. "We asked it," Larklin said, still shaking with a body's math returning to her bones. It said yes. Jonah wiped stone dust from his lips with the back of his wrist.
"It's breathing through a collapsed lens," he said, the words a field diagnosis and a prayer in the same breath. "Air pocket. Clay seam gave. Pressure equalized. We woke it careful and it didn't punish us for it." "Yet," Mavis said, practical even while her eyes drank. "Get rope. Get a gate over that mouth before it decides to teach another lesson." They moved like a small army that believed orders were the difference between miracles and funerals. Jonas sketched a crib of timbers with a finger on dust. Larkland fetched posts and the heavy farm gate from the east corral. Len stood by, muttering, and then, when he saw no one cared, grudgingly shouldered a post-hole digger and made himself into a reluctant usefulness. Vance, to his own surprise, lifted with the kind of care that parts hair. He didn't know how to hold a post. He learned. They set the crib around the ring and fixed the gate over the mouth with chain and 2 big locks that had guarded nothing important for years. When the last shackle snapped shut, Mavis exhaled like a woman who had been clenching since the year took its first dry bite. The well held. It quivered, the surface showing little physical stories. Rings where grit fell, small shoulders where air burped up, a trembling along the edge like something alive wearing patience as a coat. "Test it," Jonas said softly. Larkland lowered a bucket on a rope she trusted the way she trusted her own hands. The bucket kissed the surface, went under, came up heavy. She hauled. When she poured into a pail, the sound, it was insultingly domestic. The whole county could have knelt. Mavis did. She cupped a palm and drank. She stood. She put her hand on Larkland's cheek like she had when Larkland had knocked out her own tooth on a fence rail and tried not to cry. "You did this," she said. "We did this," Larkland said, breath catching, and she looked at Jonah as if the night had introduced them to a country they both already knew how to live in. Vance took a step closer to the well, then another. He peered, fascinated in spite of himself, then startled at his own courage. "It's cold," he said, because he knew no better word. "It will warm in the stock troughs. But in the ground, it remembers how to keep." Clement County woke that morning to gossip that tasted like water. Men came by with hats in both hands and questions they tried to hide inside jokes. Women arrived with mason jars and steady faces. Children slid under kitchen screens and ran too far ahead on the lanes. The tower stood in the yard humming its tin hymn. The chest ticked. The enamel basins filled. The well breathed and held. By noon, the bankman had tracked mud onto his good shoes 3 different ways and forgotten to care. He stood by the tower with a pencil and a pad he had intended to use like a weapon, and instead used like a student. Jonah answered the questions he chose, didn't answer the ones that didn't matter yet. Larkland poured and measured and organized. Mavis set out coffee and sliced bread, and watched for the moments that gratitude turned into crowding. Lent her words like rocks from the porch, until even he tired of watching them miss. "What else does it want?" Larkland asked Jonah, when they stepped behind the shop to breathe in the smell of clean machine and shade.
"More surface," he said. "An honest wind, a place to put what it gives so it can rest and not drown us with luck." "Tanks," she said. "2," he agreed. "High." They made a list. Oil-filled tank abandoned last year by the county road crew 3 miles east. A run of old aluminum roofing someone had hived off a collapsed barn and stacked behind the feed and seed. Copper scrap from the school roof job. The superintendent owed Mavis 2 favors on a roast. "Vance," Mavis said when they came back round the house, and the banker jumped like a boy caught behind the gym. "Get in your city car and go wake up Mr. Stokes about those road tanks he swore he was fixin' to haul. If you come back with them on a flatbed, we'll discuss what good faith means." Vance looked at Larkland, the old reflex of power and permission warring in his face. Larkland allowed herself one small, mean delight. "Go," she said. "Say please." He went. He said please. He returned with a flatbed and a new voice.
By dusk, they had 2 tanks on cribbing at the upper end of the yard, a gravity line laid from the tower to the tanks and from the tanks to the troughs, and a plan chalked onto the shop door for an evaporative cool room built from pallets and wet burlap, so meat could be kept 2 days without turning to grief. They slept 3 hours and woke to the sound of tires on gravel. Not Vance this time. 3 other trucks. Men Larkland knew by their boots and the way their laughter arrived before they did. Clay Purcell, who sold used equipment in stories with the same markup. The Talbot brothers, who measured their self-respect with other people's tape measures. And behind them, a long gooseneck holding the kind of backhoe a county usually hires, not people. Purcell climbed down with a cocked hat and a mouth that thought it was a handshake. "Heard you were drilling without a permit," he said brightly. "Figured I'd come keep the county safe." "Nobody drilled," Mavis said from the porch, her bathrobe admitting nothing and her bare feet asserting jurisdiction. "We asked politely." "The county doesn't regulate asking," Jonas said, mild. "The county regulates water," Purcell corrected and produced a paper as if conjuring. "And as of this morning, your parcel's water rights are encumbered pending review." He smiled, the way a man smiles when he is sure the word encumbered will do what bullets used to. "So we'll be taking charge of that apparatus," he gestured at the tower, "for safekeeping." Larkland laughed then. She couldn't stop herself. It came out like a bark. "Safekeeping where? In the back of your lot, behind the bulldozers you won't sell anyone for less than new price?" Purcell's face tightened. "Don't make this ugly, miss." "You brought the ugly," Mavis said. "We're hosting it politely." The Talbot brothers had already shouldered to the base of the tower, like men who've forgotten most of the uses of their shoulders. Jonah stepped between them and the braces without thinking. Len, for once, moved with him. "Don't touch what you don't understand," Len said, and his voice had finally found a note that Larkland could forgive. Purcell lifted the paper higher. "Law," he said, "signed by the county commissioner this morning." Vance, who had never in his life run anywhere except away from obligation, came trotting down the lane with a folder under his arm, his tie crooked and his face flushed from the attempt. "Hold on," he called. "Hold on now." He stopped, inhaled like a man learning to do it for use, and fixed Clay Purcell with a look usually reserved for checking signatures. "You filed that encumbrance using a statute that expired 5 years ago, and you forged the commissioner's assistant's initials, badly." Purcell blinked. "What?" "Paper," Vance said, and held up his own. "The commissioner's office sent a memo at 8:05 citing drought emergency provisions. Any equipment facilitating non-groundwater atmospheric collection is not subject to confiscation. Any reopening of previously documented wells," he gestured at the old stone ring, "is to be overseen by a county hydrologist." He patted his own chest, like a boy proud of the book report he had accidentally written. "I called 3 times. Purcell's mouth rearranged into something almost honest, irritation. "I got cousins," he said, which was to say, I know how to break a rule by knowing the man who wrote it. "Get them," Mavis said. "We have cousins too. They just show up in kitchen aprons and make better food." The Talbot brothers looked from Purcell to the tower to the well. The smallest Talbot had a daughter with a limp and eyes that made a man's temper dissolve on contact. He stared at the tank, at the overflow line, at the buckets not yet put away. He saw a bath for his girl. He lowered his hands. "I ain't taking it," he muttered, almost to himself. His brother started to argue, and then found nothing to argue with that wouldn't make him feel like he'd kicked a dog. Purcell took 2 steps back and smiled like a file. "I'll file papers for groundwater depletion," he said. "You already have," Mavis replied dryly, and went back inside to call 3 women who had been sharing bread on porches since 1979 and could get a man unelected with casserole. They worked the day under a sky that grudgingly admitted clouds like rumors. The tower breathed. The chest wrote its small song. The well held.
The tanks filled past the painted ghosts of their last useful years. Larklin's hands found a rhythm between parts and people. Jonah climbed when climbing needed doing, and his calm cut through 10 different panics before they remembered themselves as unnecessary. In the afternoon, after a boy climbed off a bicycle and handed Mavis $5 for a jar of water to carry to his mother with kidneys that had been failing the way Summers fail. After Vance sat on the step and told a story about his grandmother's rain barrel in a voice that accidentally wore reverence. After Len fixed the south fence without being told and came back with dust on his face and a look that had misplaced its blank. After all of that, the sky did what none of them wanted to trust it had the courage for. It made a sound like metal learning to be music. It lowered, it gathered, it let go a handful of honest rain. The first drop hit Larklin's cheek like an apology, then 10. Then a curtain so thin it barely made the dust think twice. But it was rain, and the county said it aloud to itself like a name it had not spoken since childhood. They didn't stop working. They did not run into the yard with faces up and mouths open like their parents had in old pictures. They looked at each other and nodded small, fierce nods, and Larklin tightened a coupling that had thought about lying to her and then changed its mind. And Jonah checked the pitch on the new panel and said nothing. The tower's output doubled for an hour. The well breathed easier. Night came with lightning walking its thin-legged way along the far ridge. They shut the tower down by halves so the wind wouldn't bully the tin. They tied off loose lines. They anchored the tanks to posts driven deeper than they could remember why they'd ever stopped. They went inside for stew that had been waiting so long it forgave them for forgetting it. After midnight, when the storm went to extract its debt from counties to the north, and the air here smelled like wet dirt and frightened, Larklin and Jonah stood by the open back door and watched the tower's silhouette relearn itself against the stars. Her shoulder ached where the stone had taught its lesson. She put her hand there, and then, without the ceremony it deserved, put that hand on Jonah's arm. "You saved me," she said, "not as a romance, but as a receipt." He shook his head. "You saved you," he said. "I just argued with gravity on your behalf." "Argue with me tomorrow," she said. "I need a better brace under the north leg." He smiled, small, the way he did, and nodded. "Yes, ma'am." They slept a little. The county did not. News can keep a place awake longer than moonshine. At dawn, 2 things happened before coffee. A white county truck rolled in, hydrology printed on the door in letters that wanted to be taken seriously, and a horse came up lame in the south pasture. The hydrologist turned out to be a woman who wore her hat like it had passed an exam to be up there. She introduced herself as Dorothea Singh, shook Mavis's hand as if Mavis were her aunt, and walked the yard like she knew how to count in more than one system. She asked smart questions. She listened when Jonah answered. She asked better questions. By the well, she kneeled and closed her eyes and put the flat of her hand on the stone and did not speak for a full minute. When she stood, she had the look of a person who had converted. Artesian pressure by entrapment. Your condenser woke it. Good bones under here. Good gravels. Your father did not put this well where it didn't belong. She placed a small orange flag in the soil. You'll tile French drains here and here to keep shoulder erosion from making fools of all of us. You'll build a stone apron 2 courses wider than this ring, and you'll mortar it like you're angry at the past. "Yes, ma'am," Larklin said, half in affection and half in relief at being told what to do by someone whose orders had the smell of knowledge.
The lame horse belonged to Len. He brought her in with an apology his face did not know how to translate. Larklin ran a hand down the fetlock and found heat. "Stone bruise," she said. "Wrap in stall. She'll write you a letter about it tomorrow and you'll pretend you can read." Len stood by while she worked. He was quieter than she'd seen him since they were both too short to change a tire. "You going to let that bank man take your water?" he asked finally, like a child asking if the dark had swallowed the hallway or just the light. Vance, who had been everywhere at once for 2 days because he did not trust himself to sit still in a world that suddenly required courage, answered from the doorway. "I'm not taking anything," he said. "I'm trying to write down what's already true." He hesitated, then folded himself into a sentence men like him didn't know how to survive. "I intend to restructure your note if you'll let me tie it to the tower as collateral." Mavis looked at him over the top of her reading glasses as if he had just asked to borrow her wedding dress. "Collateral?" He flushed. "If the apparatus fails," he said, using Jonah's word because he had not yet earned the right to use Larklin's. "The rate floats up. If it holds 12 months with documented output, the rate floats down. If you agree to allocate 10% of output to a community spigot, we call that a tax credit, and I'll find the line item." "You just made that up," Mavis said. "Yes," Vance said, "but I'll make it right on paper." Silence in which a new world found its outline. Then Jonah nodded once. "That's a decent trade." Larklin looked at Mavis. Mavis looked at the yard. She looked at the well, at the tower that had the gall to be ugly and useful in the same breath, at Dorothea's orange flags, at the horse that would forgive, at Len the boy and Len the man layered badly over the same skeleton. "We'll take it," she said, and Vance swayed and caught himself and sat down, quietly, on the stoop, and cried 3 tears he didn't think anyone saw. The next 3 days were the kind a place tells about later when it has time to like memory again. Dorothea set out her flags like a precise parade. Jonah and Larklin built the stone apron as if it were something that had insulted them and needed convincing. Len hauled with his brow down and his mouth shut and brought the bad kitchen fan out to the yard where it did no good but showed he had learned to carry. Vance drove like a courier from an old war, feed store, county office, a man with a crane who owed a favor he didn't want to remember. Mavis sat on the porch and wrote names in a spiral notebook, who'd come, what they'd carried in their hands, what they'd carried in their faces. On the 4th morning, with the apron set and the condenser scaled with new tin that gleamed like a lie trying to make amends, with the tanks plumbed better and the gravity lines humored into the slopes that made sense, with the cool room damp and kindly and already making the butter behave, with a line of children waiting for cups, not because they were thirsty, but because they wanted to watch hope poured from a spout. On that morning, trouble arrived in a coat with buttons and a badge. Sheriff Ellison was older than his uniform wanted to admit. He had a way of standing like a man listening for a kind of truth most folks don't speak in front of law. He took off his hat to Mavis and put it back on, and held a paper he hated. "I'm obliged to serve this," he said. Clay Purcell found himself a judge and Marlowe who can be persuaded by a certain kind of arithmetic. He handed Larklin an injunction with a seal that made things worse by being embossed. Temporary restraining order on operation pending the adjudication of water rights. He cleared his throat. "I'm not going to let you run the tower. I can't let you pump the well." He looked at the line of children and at the community spigot Mavis had painted blue that morning because blue looks like a future when you've been staring at brown. He said, "I'm not going to chain a spigot," making a very small rebellion in public. Dorothea Singh appeared from behind the tank with a tape measure like a sword. "I spoke to the state," she said, crisp enough to cut. "This order overreaches, but it will take a day to unwind." "A day," Mavis repeated, the word heavy as a skillet. "What do you want us to tell the woman with dialysis at noon, Sheriff?" Ellison flinched. "I want you to tell her to come back tomorrow," he said, cursing himself in his face for saying it. Larklin felt the old anger step into her spine, the righteous, useless kind. She looked at Jonah because he had the other kind, the kind that fixes a brace instead of kicking it. He met her look and nodded once toward the shop. They went in. He closed the door with his heel. "We can't shut down," she said, low, the sentence worn smooth by centuries of people who've said it and been made to anyway. "We can't get chained," he said back. "We lose either way if we play their game on the yard." He laid out lengths of copper and 2 pumps on the bench. "So we won't." "What are we going to do?"
Hide the work in work they don't know how to see. He pointed at the tanks. We decouple the condenser from this line. We run an auxiliary to the east lot through the fence line, bury it shallow, no more than a spade's depth. We set a second spigot on the far side of the hedgerow by the old bus. We keep this one chained and pretty. We feed the other one like a vein. "That's getting arrested work," she said, not trying to talk him out of it, just naming it so the heir would understand the ticket it was buying. "It's getting people through a day work," he said. "I'll take the first part if you'll take the second." They nodded. They moved. Len saw, and for once didn't announce it with his mouth. He took a shovel and went to the east lot and made dust and called it landscaping to anyone who bothered to ask. Dorothea wrote a long email with words that could burn a judge's temper and CC'd 6 names that could get a man reappointed or not. Mavis stood on the porch right in the middle like a lighthouse, absorbing Sheriff Ellison's regret and reflecting it back at him in a wavelength that made him rub his eyes and say he'd left something in the truck and go sit in it for a while to forget why his hand was shaking. By late afternoon, a new spigot existed that only people who needed it would find. They came. They brought jars with flowers painted on them and 4-gallon plastic from a summer that had seemed easier. They brought children with questions. They brought dignity and tried to pay it with it. But Larkland refused every coin and took every thank you and kept a ledger Mavis had started with names and needs and the kind of notes no banker had a box for. Carla, 2 quarts, laughed. Vance hovered with paperwork he wanted very much to keep secret from his own kind. "I can move escrow in 48 hours, he told Mavis in a whisper that held no arrogance at all. "If your note is collateralized to a community utility entity, a private attachment won't land the same way." He swallowed. "I used to love paper. I'm learning to love what's written on it." At sunset, when the sky tried on pink and decided it would rather be steel, Sheriff Ellison got a call he took with his hat off. He put it back on and looked at Dorothea and looked like a man who didn't enjoy talking when the news wasn't his. "Judge vacated. Orders gone in the morning. Clay's going to be mad enough to make a fool of himself, so tie down what can be tied down." Rub my face. "I'll be by at 6 with coffee. Don't tell anyone." They didn't sleep. They tightened and braced and laid fresh pitch and checked the chain on the gate over the well and put an extra lock on the tank ladder, because trouble climbs when it runs out of other tricks. In the small hours, a coyote sang from the mesquite in a key that sounded like warning. Larkland stood at the yard's edge and looked out at a county that had for a handful of hours decided to remember itself as a place with a right to breathe. Jonah came and stood without making her have to narrate what she knew she was already thinking. "I don't want to go back," she said, meaning the world as it had been built around the idea that scarcity made men. "Then don't," he said. "Build a new one so loud it drowns the old." He put a hand on her shoulder and left it there like a promise he would keep as long as he had blood. Morning broke like sheet metal. Sheriff Ellison appeared with coffee and the look of a man planning to stand in front of a freight train and pretend to be a rock. Dorothea posted a copy of the judge's order vacating the injunction on the fence with tape so mean it took paint when removed. Mavis made pancakes in a quantity that made the griddle smoke like a controlled burn. The community spigot, both of them, ran. At 9, Clay Purcell returned with more cousins, and this time he brought a man in a suit that had never seen dust and a shaved head shiny enough to insult the sun. The man walked like he was used to buying answers instead of listening to them. "Morning," he said without evidence he meant it.
Daniel Mox. He handed Vance a card that said Mox Resource Extraction and had a logo that looked like a drill bit making a promise it wouldn't keep. We've purchased a controlling interest in several distressed properties in Clement County, including lien positions tied to this parcel. He smiled as if to say, "See? I said 6 words, and now I own your water. We're here to make an offer before things get adversarial." "What's the offer?" Mavis asked, before Larkland could ruin it by spitting. "Cash," Mox said smoothly, and named a number that could kill a farm and raise a house in town. "You vacate. We assume all outstanding obligations. We'll of course maintain access to water for the community in a controlled fashion within county guidelines." He said controlled and looked at the spigot like it was a child with a knife. "No," Larkland said. "You'll want to confer," he said, indulgent. "I'll wait."
Mavis very nearly invited him to wait in the road. Instead, she looked at Dorothea. Dorothea, who had spent the last 24 hours falling in technical love with the geology under their feet, had no time for performance. "No," she said, and not just no, hell no. Mox's smile thinned. "We'll be filing a claim to the aquifer under this parcel within the hour," he said. "Our purchase includes dormant rights dating to 1911. "Your purchase includes a forgery and a curse," Dorothea said, the scientist version of throwing a drink. "The 1911 filing you're about to wave at us is void ab initio. It predates the state compact. It is stapled to a property description that crawled out of a bottle, and it was drafted by a man who thought artesian meant owned by an artist." Mox's ears pinked. "You're very sure of yourself." "I'm paid to be," she replied, "and in this instance, I'm right." Mox looked past her at the tower, at the tanks, at the men and women gathered with their coffee and their children, at Sheriff Ellison leaning on his county truck, like a barn that had decided to stand between a wind and anything it cared about. His eyes slid back to Jonah, measuring. He smiled, smaller now. "You built this?" Jonah did not answer. Mox kept smiling. "You'll find I can pay you to build anywhere you like." "I'm building here," Jonah said. Mox sighed as if the theater bored him. "Well then," he said, "we'll make it adversarial." He lifted his hand. 2 men stepped forward with a cutting torch on a dolly. Sheriff Ellison's hand dropped to his belt in a gesture he didn't complete. Vance went pale, then red. Len swore under his breath in a tone that, for the first time, sounded like prayer. "Try it," Mavis said, her voice a skillet. Mox nodded to his men. "Cut the chain," he said, casual as if ordering lunch. The torch kissed blue. The world shrank to a bead of white fire. The chain on the gate over the well looked very old and very ready to prove something. "Back," Jonah said, already moving to step in, because a man who knows what fire does moves faster than a man who only knows what it looks like. "Don't," Larkland said, fingers on his sleeve. "Let them show us what kind of country they think they own." The torch touched metal, the chain spit and screamed and began to let go, a link at a time. Sheriff Ellison took 1 step forward and then another, slower than he wanted to because the law is a bad pair of boots in a sprint. Dorothea pulled out her phone and started recording because naming the devil on paper sometimes keeps him from going to church later. Vance had the look of a man who had finally discovered a use for fear. The chain's final link winked red. The locked gate hitched. It broke. The topstones that had always wanted to pretend they were tired shifted in that instant. The gate dropped a hair. The ring gave a little groan that rode up Larkland's bones like a climbing child. The well, insulted, drew a long breath. A dark, cold scent hit the yard like a century breathing out. Mox took 1 pleased step toward the mouth, ownership in his stride. And the earth spoke in a voice none of them had earned the right to hear. It was not a collapse, not yet. It was a settling with prophecy in it. The ring moved. The apron they had built held against sense. The gate tilted, caught, held, then tilted again. Jonah grabbed the chain to steady it and went to one knee as the world chose a new angle. Larkland moved to his side on instinct. Sheriff Ellison brought his shoulder under the nearest brace because a man knows how to be a brace, even when his job tells him to be a witness. Dorothea dropped the phone and grabbed the other chain. Vance clutched the post with white knuckles and remembered a prayer in a language he hadn't used since his grandmother's kitchen. The well's breath changed. It deepened.
It became not a rush of water upward, but a dragging inward, as if the county had put its mouth to a straw and drawn. Loose dust in the torch's hose slithered towards the mouth. The cutting crew yelled and leapt back. Mock stared, calculation canceled by physics for the first time this year. "Back," Jonah said, already moving to step in because a man who knows what fire does moves faster than a man who only knows what it looks like. The chain slipped 3 inches through his hands. It burned his palm. He held anyway. Larklyn threw her weight onto the gate and felt, with the intimacy of a held breath, the exact moment the old lime mortar chose to remember how to be sand. The outer course of stones bucked, the gate slid, the mouth yawned wider. And something, a rim, an edge, not stone, showed itself 2 feet down inside the ring, where no one had ever thought to look because no one had ever made the county say "ah" quite like this. Not rock, not clay. Iron. Curved. Riveted. Familiar in a way that made Larklyn's stomach drop and leap in the same instant. An iron lid, the twin to the chest that had started all this, set into the side of the well like a secret that had spent 100 years waiting for a sister to knock. "Stop!" Larklyn cried, voice breaking like a throw. "Don't move it!" But Clay Purcell, who had thought himself decisive since he bought his first bad bulldozer, lunged as if a handle had been offered to his hand by ancestry. He grabbed the exposed, riveted lip and yanked. The iron lid groaned, ancient hinges crying out a sound that skinned the yard. The well's breath reversed again. Water hissed up the shaft, cold and furious. "It's a sluice," Dorothea shouted over the sudden roar. "It's a side gate, feeding a chamber." The iron lid heaved wider. The gate lurched. Jonah lost purchase on the chain and caught it again, and felt something in his shoulder give way like a lie. "Jonah!" Larklyn grabbed him. The well's throat bellowed. A round black rush rocketed up. Not a geyser, not yet, but enough to make men run and women stand where they were because there is a kind of courage they invented for exactly this. Mock stumbled backward, shocked pale, the torch team falling over their own equipment. Sheriff Ellison hung on and swore a farmer's swears. Vance shut his eyes and saw his grandmother's rain barrel and opened them again and held. Water hit the underside of the tilted gate and splashed in a tall fan that caught the light and made the yard a brief cathedral. Then it retreated. The gate settled, shaking. The iron lid moved another inch on its own, a tongue pressed by pressure from behind. "Everybody off!" Dorothea yelled. "If that side gate goes all at once, we'll take the whole ring with it." They stumbled back. Larklyn pulled Jonah with her and hated every inch of ground she gave. The well's throat bellowed. A round black rush rocketed up. Not a geyser, not yet, but enough to make men run and women stand where they were because there is a kind of courage they invented for exactly this. Mock stumbled backward, shocked pale, the torch team falling over their own equipment. Sheriff Ellison hung on and swore a farmer's swears. Vance shut his eyes and saw his grandmother's rain barrel and opened them again and held. Mock swallowed, found his voice, and tried on his smile again like a suit he'd spilled soup on and hoped no one noticed. "Well," he said weakly, "seems unstable. Another reason to let professionals—" Larklyn stepped toward him. He stepped back. She did not stop. "You cut our chain. You nearly dropped a gate on a county. You don't get to say professionals." His jaw clenched. "This isn't over," he managed. "No, it's beginning." He fled, that's the word for it, and Purcell went with him, and the cousins with the torch found urgent business far away from here. Sheriff Ellison hung on and swore a farmer's swears. Vance shut his eyes and sought his grandmother's rain barrel and opened them again and held. Jonah flexed his burned palm and shook his shoulder like a man negotiating with a familiar hurt. He looked at Larklyn and smiled, not small this time. "Iron," he said. "The same language. she answered, and felt a current run from her hand to his and back that had nothing to do with copper. Dorothea knelt and peered into the mouth as far as a person with sense would. Your great-grandfather, I'd bet, or the man before him, set a side sluice in, maybe to feed a cistern for bad years, maybe to run a ram to a winter house, maybe to hide what the county would have stolen in a good year. Your chest out there, she jerked her chin toward the yard, that's a piece of the language he spoke. He used iron to teach water where to go. What now? Mavis asked, not because she doubted there was a what, but because she needed its shape so she could start making biscuits for it.
We braced this ring like it married our sisters, Dorothea said. We weld a new gate and we bolted to the old through the masonry. We fabricate a key for that iron lid that doesn't look like one, in case certain cousins return with better paper. We open it when we're ready, not when it gets bored. We build a ram, Jonah said softly, eyes still in the dark. We let the well pump itself. No electricity, no noise, just gravity arguing with pulse and losing on purpose. Larkland felt the map of her place redraw behind her eyes. The tower, the tanks, the cool room, the spigots, the well, the iron throat inside it, an old man's language shapes underfoot that she had been walking on, illiterate, for years. She smiled, fierce and new. We make the county speechless, she said. They did not notice Len slip away until the screen door announced his absence with a nervous shiver. He returned 10 minutes later with a cardboard box he held like a confession. Found this in the north shed, he said, not meeting anyone's eyes. Back of the loft. Been there since we were kids, I guess. I took it to keep you from doing... He swallowed. From doing smarter things than me. He set it on the porch table and opened the top. Inside, wrapped in burlap and the smell of mouse, lay a sheaf of papers bound by a crude leather strap and a bag of metal that clinked with a voice Larkland had learned to recognize. Old bolts, hand cup, a small iron lever shaped like an S, forged by a person who made tools the way other folks make prayers, with intent in heat. Dorothea reached for the papers the way a person reaches for a baby they can't believe is theirs. She rolled the strap and eased the bundle open. The first page was a map, not county survey, not properly seldom. An arc of a well mouth, a square, a curved line marked with dots like a necklace. In a careful hand, Sluice 1, Sluice 2, Winter Line, Summer Catch, and at the bottom, in script that made Larkland's throat hurt, Shaw, 1912. Oh, Dorothea breathed. Oh. Mavis leaned over her, eyes sharp. He was a sly old cuss, she said affectionately, and there was pride in it older than dust. Jonah lifted the S-shaped lever from the burlap. He turned it in his hand. The metal fit his grip the way a hammer does when it knows the man who holds it. He crouched at the well and lowered the lever toward the exposed, riveted lip of the iron lid. The end slid into a notch worn by 100 years of waiting. It's a key, he said. Don't, Dorothea snapped, then softened. Please, not yet. He smiled up at her. I wasn't going to turn it. He said it, and the way he said it made Larkland suspect that the part of him that wanted to was exactly the part she trusted to wait. They built like a blessing. The ram pump Jonah drew on the shop door by lantern glow looked like a child's toy and worked like gossip, relentless, without needing anyone's permission. Len took to it like building something that moved water was an apology recipe he could finally read. Mavis learned to thread pipe and gave himself a blister that looked like penance. Mavis wrote a list under the list. Widows, men who had fallen off ladders, the young woman at the end of Prairie Road whose husband had left and taken the last good bucket because punishing her with inconvenience felt like power to him. Dorothea wrote a letter to 2 journals and used all her big words in service of a simple sentence. This land remembers. On the 5th evening, they stood around the well again, not a crowd, now but a quorum. The new gate hung at true, welded to the old chain brackets and braced into stone that had decided to earn its keep for once.
The S lever waited in Jonah's palm like a story that had rehearsed itself for a century. "What happens if we open it?" Len asked, voice small, not from fear of water, but from fear of what waiting had made in him. "Maybe nothing," Dorothea said. "Maybe the sluice runs to a cistern under the north pasture, and we hear a big inhale with no exhale, and then the county learns what a recharge field is. Maybe it feeds a vault under the old stone shed, and the floor kisses us hello. Maybe it's a relief gate for when the water runs high after 3 good years and carries the excess into a channel to the creek. Maybe it was meant to be turned with the seasons, open in June, close in September, paired with a condenser on dry nights to slip water downhill to a place that can keep it cool. Maybe," Mavis said. "Or maybe Great-Granddaddy Shaw put a door where a door didn't belong because he wanted something to come through and forgot to write down what." They laughed because not laughing would have broken something delicate. Larklin looked at Jonah. He looked at her. Both of them nodded. "Slow," Dorothea said one more time. "To the future." Jonah slid the lever into the notch. The metal settled in like a last piece in a puzzle someone had worked on in secret for the length of 2 wars and 27 Thanksgiving tables. He leaned, carefully, and the lever moved a fraction. The lid shifted. The well breathed and did not complain. He leaned another fraction. Another click. Water murmured as if it was remembering a route. Far below, something acknowledged something. "Half turn," Dorothea whispered, hand hovering like a benediction over the stones. He gave it the last of the half turn. The lid opened a hand's breadth, and the hum in the well deepened from warning to working. They waited. In the silence, they heard the ram begin to talk to itself in the yard. Tick, tick, tick. The tower chimed 10 agreeing with temperature. The tank sighed. The county held.
"Close it," Dorothea said at last, as much to prove they could as to obey her own caution. Jonah reversed the motion. The lever resisted, then yielded. The lid seated. The breath lightened. The well remembered being only a well. "Tomorrow," she said, "we open it a little more." "Tomorrow," Mavis said, tasting the word like sugar. They turned to go inside and were met on the porch by a face Larklin had not expected to see for another week and had not prepared to see at all. Her mother's sister, Loop, stood with a suitcase that had a broken wheel and a mouth pressed into a line that said she was finished letting a boy in Tulsa tell her when to sleep. Beside her, holding her hand, a child with hair coiled like a promise looked up at the tower with an expression that made Larklin fall hopelessly in love with the idea of tomorrow again. "We came," Loop said simply. "Word travels faster than trouble if the women are the ones carrying it." They made beds and reheated soup and folded grief into corners where it couldn't trip anyone tonight. Larklin tucked the child into the cot in her room and told a story about a horse that learned to drink without being told it was thirsty. The child's eyes slid shut halfway through the part where the horse saved an entire town by pointing at a cloud and making it believe itself. Outside, the yard kept its hum. In the east lot, the secret spigot spoke to people who needed secrets. Sheriff Ellison's truck rolled by twice without stopping. Vance sat in his car with the dome light on and wrote something that looked like a confession on First Clement letterhead, and then tore it up very carefully and put the pieces in his pocket to throw away somewhere no one would know. Near dawn, Larklin woke to the sound of a door on its worst habit. She slid her boots on without lacing and went into the hall. Lynn's room was empty. She went to the porch. The yard yawned blue and wide. At the well, a shape bent where no shape should be at this hour. "Lynn," she said, voice flat with fatigue too old for her age. He started, hands guilty. The S lever glinted in his fist. He had it in the notch. The iron lid had moved a finger's width. "What are you doing?" she asked, and the only kind of fury left to her was the kind that wants to know the verb. He didn't meet her eyes. "They were in town last night," he said, "Mox's men, at the bar.
talking like this place is theirs already, laughing like they got you measured. He swallowed. I wanted to open it, all the way, flood the ring and drown their paper. His hand jerked. The lid squealed a hair farther. I wanted to make it ours so loud the county couldn't pretend not to hear. Stop, she said, right now. I can't keep up, he said, finally looking at her with the kind of nakedness she had prayed for and dreaded. You and him and your science lady and the bank boy that decided to be a man, you all know how to hold a wrench and a sentence. I only know how to break things and then complain. He laughed, dry and mean at himself. So I thought, if I broke the right thing. You'll drown us, she said, stepping forward. You'll take the ring and the apron and the gate and the tank and the tower with it, and you'll give Mox a headline he can buy another judge with. He squeezed his eyes shut. His hand tightened on the lever the way a boy tightens on a slingshot right before he commits to a broken window. Len, she said, and this time it was a whole childhood said in one word. Please. He opened his eyes. The old parish stubborn sat there next to something that looked new and bruise-colored and honest. He let his hand loosen. A sound interrupted them that did not belong to their argument. The low, deliberate growl of diesel and a gear meant for pushing. Larklin turned toward the road and saw 3 vehicles crest the lane. The county's smallest bulldozer on a borrowed trailer, 2 black pickups with lights tucked behind the grills like teeth, and behind them a tanker with the Mox logo like a bruise you can't hide. Get Mavis, Larklin said. Get Jonah. Get Dorothea. Wake the town if you have to. Lynn nodded, terrified and a little redeemed by having something to be useful at. He ran. Larklin stayed with the well. She planted her boots the way you plant fence posts when you intend to hang a gate that holds. The trucks rolled into the yard without asking. Men stepped out who wore shirts with their names sewn on women they didn't speak to kindly. The bulldozer's engine ticked as it cooled. The tanker's hose shivered in a way that made Larklin think of snakes. Mox climbed down last. He carried a clipboard that had never known a grocery list. This is trespass, Larklin said. This is enforcement, he said pleasantly. The judge in Marlow revised his order overnight after a conversation with counsel. You are to cease and desist all water diversion pending the appointment of a special master. He held the paper out like it was a vaccination, and she should thank him for it.
She didn't take it. Get off my land. We're not here to hurt you, Mox said, with the practiced patience of a man who uses the same sentence on every county and only changes the name. We're here to protect the aquifer from irresponsible manipulation. That strange ironwork in your well? He nodded at the mouth, where the iron lid peered like a patient eye. Could compromise the formation. We'll install a bypass and a monitoring sleeve. We'll take your tower for study. If it proves efficacious, we'll license it. You can apply for a stipend under our Community Resilience Program. He smiled. You'll be able to tell your neighbors you helped. You talk like a man who thinks help is a thing people put on like a hat. We wear ours in our hands, Larklin said. Jonah arrived at a run, shirt misbuttoned, eyes steady. Dorothea followed with her boots unlaced and her voice already loaded with statutes. Mavis came with a shotgun broken open across her arm, not pointed at anyone because she didn't have to. Sheriff Ellison's truck rode in right behind them, like a man trying to decide if today was the day his job required him to become history instead of law. You don't have a lawful order, Dorothea said without preamble. You have a friendly piece of paper. That's not the same thing. Mox held out the counseling smile again. Ma'am, maybe you should let the gentleman handle. Finish that sentence, Mavis suggested, very calm. And I'll salt your shoes so they squeak when you try to sneak. He didn't. He nodded to the bulldozer operator. Put the blade on that tower, he said. We'll start there. The operator hesitated. He looked at Sheriff Ellison. The sheriff didn't move. He looked at the tower. He looked at Larklin,
who looked back with a gaze that did not blink. He looked at the tanker, at the hose, at the men behind it in matching shirts and matching soles. He took a breath that made a noise. He set the blade. He eased forward slow, like a man trying not to scratch a polished floor with a coffin. Jonah took 3 steps and put his hands on the tower's west brace, as if a human body could convincingly argue with a machine. Larklin moved to the north brace. Len ran from the porch and took the east, as if the last 5 years of his choices had been a rehearsal for this single use of his arms. Dorothea stepped in front of the dozer and put both hands up, and said very calmly, "Sir, if you move that machine another inch, I will lay down in front of it, and the scandal of what happens next will unelect your cousin." The operator stopped. He swore. He looked at Mox. Mox's smile peeled like paint. Behind them, the tanker's hose snaked, then bumped and coughed, and a thick smell of something chemical and cold shouldered its way into the yard. "What is that?" Vance asked, eyes wide. Mox didn't look at him. He said, "Neutralizing agent. For the well." Dorothea's voice sharpened into a weapon. "You put that in the ground and you'll kill this aquifer for 10 sections," she said. "You'll be drinking your own marketing for a decade." "It'll settle. It'll settle in your bones," she snapped. The hose lifted, alive in men's hands. "Touch that gate," Mavis said, and now the shotgun came off her arm and did not point at the sky. "And you will find out if a jury of your peers thinks a woman's property rights is a joke." The men paused, because certain sentences have more authority than a badge. Larklin felt the S-lever heavy in her pocket, where she had shoved it when she stopped Len from being the wrong kind of brave. She felt the iron lid in the well under her boots, like a heartbeat under an old coat. She felt the tower at her back, the ram in the yard, the tank's slow breath, the county's new language learning itself in troubled air. Mox lifted his hand again. The bulldozer's engine revved. The hosemen shifted their weight. "Jonah," Larklin said, not taking her eyes off the line of the blade, as it edged toward the tin. "If they go for the gate, we open it." He didn't ask which one. He didn't ask by how much. He nodded once. He moved to the well. "Don't!" Dorothea warned, low and horrified and resigned all at once. "It's ours," Larklin said. "We choose how it speaks." Mox saw Jonah step to the ring and finally thought to be afraid of a man without a weapon. "Stop him," he snapped. 2 of the matching men lunged toward the well mouth. Jonah slid the lever into the notch. The bulldozer's blade kissed the tower's west brace, and the tin screamed a note that made children in 3 houses wake up and cry without knowing why. The tanker's hose swung toward the gate like a snake that had finally noticed where the dark was. Larklin planted her feet. She reached for the lever with Jonah. Together, they turned. The iron lid moved, and the well answered. It came up like a low, furious hymn. Not a burst, not a catastrophe, but pressure translated into speech. The lever in Larklin's hands trembled with the throat of the county. The iron lid slid a thumb's width. Cold surged up, polished as a blade. The ringstones moaned. The new steel gate flexed and held. The first breath of water slapped the underside and sprayed, a fan that dazzled the men at the tanker and left clean streaks on their cheeks where dust had been. The bulldozer's blade bit tin again and squealed. "Half only!" Dorothea cried over the noise. "Let it talk! Don't let it shout!" Larklin felt Jonah's shoulder against hers, the heat of his skin at her forearm, the burn of his earlier wound singing its own sharp note. She gave the lever the smallest admission. The lid answered with a click. The well's voice deepened, found its vowel, and held. Water rose within the throat like language becoming law. Mox waved at the hose crew, his poise abruptly leaky. "Keep back!" he barked, at the very thing he brought. The men hesitated because they were, in the end, men with mothers. A ribbon of water arced from under the gate and cut the toe of Mox's polished boot. He startled, affronted by an element that didn't recognize ownership. Sheriff Ellison took 2 steps and placed himself between the dozer and the brace. "That's enough," he said, quiet and deep, and though the dozer was louder, his voice was heavier. The operator shut the blade down a fraction, and the tower stopped screaming and settled into a complaint. The tanker crew still held the hose. The smell of the chemical pummeled the air. Dorothea moved to them with a scientist's fury and a schoolteacher's precision. "You dumped that, and I will personally testify at the hearing that you intentionally poisoned a public resource. The maps I sent to the state last night will become exhibits. The mothers on this road will become plaintiffs. Your employer will discover the market value of shame." One of the men shifted. He looked young when he forgot to be hard. He lowered the hose an inch and glanced at Mox. "Point it at the stock tank. Demonstration only. Then we'll tie—" "No," Larklin said, and her voice cut like a brander laden too long in the coals. "Nobody pours a thing until you look at this." She jerked her chin at Vance, who, to his horror, stepped forward because somebody had said his name like it belonged. He held up a sheaf of papers that smelled like toner and fear. "As of 7:43 this morning, First Clement Savings no longer holds a lien position on this parcel. The note has been reassigned to the Shaw Community Utility Cooperative, a nonprofit entity duly registered with the state. I am the acting trustee." He dragged in a breath. "I have also filed notice that any material interference with cooperative assets constitutes conversion under Statute 281.3. Mox stared at him, baffled and briefly mortal. "You what?" "He stole your thunder," Mavis translated sweetly, "before you could steal ours." "Paper tricks," Mox said, but the edge was off. "Your cooperative isn't recognized." "It is now," Dorothea said, and tapped her phone with the brisk delight of a woman who had emailed 6 offices before dawn. "Secretary of State's number's on the corner. You're welcome to read it, but you'll need to stand still while you do. Try it. It's character building." The hose in the men's hands sagged. The dozer idled like a tired animal deciding it wanted breakfast instead of trouble. The tower bled rivulets of rain from last night's metal and stood like a stubborn flower. The well hummed its hymn and threw up a spray with the righteous waste of a choir loft. "Close to a quarter," Dorothea called, doing math with her ear. "We'll hold pressure that way." Larklin and Jonah eased the lever back. The iron lip kissed its notch and stuck, then relented, then settled with the half-moan of old hinges remembering why they were born. The surge eased. The spray softened. The voice of the well found a sustainable word and repeated it. Present, present, present. Mox looked around and saw for the first time not machines but people, not opposition but a congregation. Mox with her shotgun like a hymn book, Sheriff Ellison with his hat in the crease of his elbow like a vow, Len with his hands on the brace like a confession that had finally changed shape from shame into work. Vance, the banker who loved numbers because he had been afraid of the arithmetic of love, holding paper he had used like a ladder instead of a shackle. Dorothea with dust on her cheeks like war paint. Jonah with his burned palm and his burned past, smiling slightly because the lever had obeyed. Larklin, eyes bright, hands dirty, mouth set in a line that promised the day what it would be.
"This isn't over," Mox said again, softer. His voice had lost its gloss. It sounded like a man realizing the world was not a hallway he owned. "We'll be back with," he reached for a word, "better orders." "Bring a casserole," Mavis suggested. "We can all eat them." The tanker backed out. The hosman avoided looking at anyone. The dozer operator took his hat off in apology and then, remembering he was on someone else's payroll, put it back on and stared hard at his boots. The pickups left with their teeth unbared. The yard exhaled. Larklyn didn't, not yet. She kept her hands on the lever because the habit of scarcity leans on your knuckles long after a spigot turns. She felt the low pulse in the iron, alive, particular, persuasive. She could sense the river of little causes down there meeting and arguing. Clay seam, gravel pocket, pressure lens, the long, slow push of an artesian spine. She'd learned to hear machines, now she was learning to hear land. She was careful who she told. "Let's get ahead of their next letter," Jonah said, as if reading the page her brain had turned to. "We document everything. We build redundancies that look like recipes. We teach teenagers how to fix the ram with baling water. We make failure boring." "You make speeches like you're hammering in a post," Mavis said, pleased. "It's about time this yard had a foreman who wasn't dead." Ellison cleared his throat, a man returning from something interior. He said, "Miss Shaw," to Larklyn because he had decided she was the one you spoke to if you wanted the thing done. "I'm going to post a notice on your fence. Not a legal one, a human one. It's going to say that anyone who comes out here with more paper than manners is going to leave with less paper. It's not binding in court. It'll bind a few men's mouths." "Do it," she said. She felt old and new at once, the way barbed wire looks on a cedar post. By noon, the yard had converted itself from battlefield to worksite to festival to church and back to worksite. Vance wrote bylaws with Mavis leaning over him, correcting his nouns, replacing every shall with will, because shall is for people who plan to break their word. Dorothea ran tests that made the children hold their breath, as if the color in a tube might decide to be a rainbow if they behaved. Jonah and Len built a guard cage over the lever that looked like a simple precaution and worked like a lock you could open if you knew the password in your hands. The water kept coming. Not excessive, not paltry. A truth arriving at a pace a place could use. Larklyn made herself sit in the shade for 9 minutes because Mavis said her hands were shaking a little, and a person who won't sit when told by someone who loves them is begging the world to teach them gently. She sipped coffee made with arrogance. She watched Lupe's little girl, Tulia, carry a jar with the seriousness of a saint. She watched the sky, which had remembered how to put on clouds like pearls, drift a little closer. She put a palm on her shoulder where the bruise would be and thought of Jonah's hand there the night before. Wait, promise, the old language of yes. "What's the plan after we prove it holds?" she asked him that afternoon, when he came down off the tower smelling like summit and solder. "Feed neighboring troughs," he said. "Teach 4 more yards what we did here. Put one on the church roof and let the pastor preach about science from the pulpit. Build a cool room at the clinic. Plumb a line to the school so kids think water comes from neighbors." "And Mox?" "We outlast him. And when he finally shuts up, we make him sign something that keeps him from speaking in our names ever again." He studied her bruised shoulder, the way a man studies a blueprint he respects. "And we build you a brace that lets you lift without hearing that bone again." She wanted to tell him that the brace she needed was not for a shoulder. It was for the part of a person that keeps trying even after trying has chewed the inside of their mouth raw. But language is a mule. It will not walk until it decides to. On the 7th day, the hydrologist returned with an engineer from the state and a camera crew that tried to pretend it wasn't a camera crew. Dorothea introduced no one. She gestured at the tower and at the well and at the tanks and watched as the engineer, small, tidy, skeptical, was smudged into belief the way kids are smudged into dirt by afternoon. He tried to find the trick. The trick kept working like gravity. The cameraman asked Larklyn if she would stand by the spigot and say the name of the sponsor who had paid for the segment.
No, Larkland said, easy. The cameraman appealed to Jonah with a facial expression designed in a laboratory to coax the shy. Jonah politely told him to record with his ears. This is a county project. We have no sponsors except old men who put iron where it belonged and women who remember phone trees.
Mox did not return in person. His letters did. They arrived several times folded into themselves like regret. Vance opened them with a letter opener that had belonged to his grandfather and translated each sentence into something the county could answer. He posted responses on the co-op board with simple titles. No. Why? No again. Because. Brings soup. At the end of the second week, the ram thawked with the pleased regularity of a heart at rest. The tower gleamed, patched and pitched, and smarter than it had been. The wells in 2 neighboring yards breathed a little easier because the aquifer had remembered it was a quilt. The cool room held butter like promises. The children invented games with rules that involved fetching water for elders without spilling a drop. And 25 years later, some of those rules would be the only laws that made sense to them in harder counties. It should have been enough. The county was not used to enough. It had taught itself to expect the kick when it laid a hand on the world's flank. On a morning grilled by a September sun that had changed its mind about kindness again, a column of dust rose from the south road and resolved itself into something Larkland didn't know whether to name. 3 horse trailers, a cattle truck, 9 men on horseback, hats low, faces closed, and a flag on a pole rigged to a bumper that made Dorothea cuss under her breath. A company standard with a star and a stylized river that insulted both action and metaphor. They did not stop at the fence. They rode in like a parade raised by a grudge. People paused. Larkland walked out to meet them because there are moments you discover how the bones in your legs want to be used. The lead rider was the kind of handsome that sours milk. Smooth, confident, about 40. He wore the star on his belt, because men like him confuse ownership with courage. He reined in and gave her a smile designed to look like a concession. "Miss Shaw," he said, "I'm Coulter Mox, Daniel's brother." "Congratulations," she said. He laughed. "We like to introduce the right face for the right problem," he said. "Daniel's the paper face. I'm the face that knows how land commits to work." He looked past her at the tower, at the well, at Jonah tightening something that did not look like it wanted to be tightened at all. "We're going to lay a line from this well to our holding tanks down valley. We'll compensate you. We'll guarantee a minimum allotment for your operation. We'll take on legal liability for any spills. The county will be taken care of. Your cooperative can be folded into a district. It's all very modern." He spread his hands. "You get to be heroes and stop worrying about siphons in the night." "What do you get?" Larkland asked. He said, "The right to grow. The right to supply water to a refinery that will bring 200 jobs." "Jobs doing what?" Mavis asked from the porch, because she had heard jobs used as the sermon for too many sins. Coulter smiled. He said, "Jobs building prosperity," a phrase so round and empty you could pour deceit into it and watch it slosh. Dorothea answered by listing at speed the cancer rates of the last refinery town this company had built. Coulter's smile did not move. He suggested those were complicated. She suggested he was lying. He suggested her degrees were political. She suggested his boots were. Jonah stepped to Larkland's shoulder. His presence steadied her ears. "We're not selling a straw into our throat," he said. Coulter's men spread in a lazy arc like a gossip that had gotten out of its chair. Their horses flicked flies from their bellies with tails that did not respect property lines. Tulia stood behind Larkland's knee and put her small hand around Larkland's finger. Mox noticed and turned the volume on his smile down, as if children ought to make a man gentle. It didn't take. "Don't be foolish. You think you can protect this place from every letter, every truck, every order. There's a kind of man in this county who understands that if something can be moved, it will be. I'm here to offer you a way to get paid while watching it happen. I've met that kind of man,
and looked deliberately at Len and back to Coulter. And some of them learn better. The rest get tired of their own voice eventually. Coulter's eye cooled. He flicked 2 fingers. His men dismounted. One made for the tank ladder. Another came to the spigot and evaluated it like he would a heifer. Larkland stepped in and said a name their grandmother had used when the boys dragged their boots on the kitchen floor. It was not a curse. It was worse. The man stopped without knowing why.
Coulter's brother had used paper. Coulter intended to use procedure wrapped in politeness, wrapped in inevitability. But inevitability has a smell, and the yard had learned a new one. Choice. He took a breath, like a man deciding to close a door on his better sense. "Bring it down," he called to no one in particular, and 2 of his men went to the tower with a crowbar and a grin. They did not get as far as their own shadows. The sound that stopped them was small, but it made the yard tense like a muscle. The ram's tuck went off rhythm. Larkland turned and saw the pump hiccup, cough, and stall. The tower, at the same time, give a long metallic sigh the way a tight thing sighs when a trickle of its purpose is misaligned. The well's hum stepped down half a note. The whole place said the same thing in 3 voices. Careful. Dorothea was already moving, hair coming down, tape measure swinging. She put a palm to the tank, then to the ram's outlet. "Airlock," she said, "and the tower's south coil just slipped a fraction." She pointed at Jonah without looking. "West brace, have turn on the top bolt and call me doctor so I go faster." Jonah ran. Lynn ran after him. Vance picked up the T-wrench without being told and found the top bolt by what Larkland could only think of as prayer by practice. Coulter watched, fascinated, against his professional religion. "You shouldn't have to maintain this constantly," he commented. Meaning, let me take it. Let it be my problem. You aren't built for this much attention. "You're right," Larkland said. "We should be teaching 5 more yards to help carry the attention. We will. After you leave." The men at the tank ladder looked at the sheriff. He did not touch his gun. He touched the bill of his hat. It was enough. They climbed down. Coulter tried one more door. He stopped, smiling. "You're making enemies you don't know how to manage," he said. "Every day you arrive is a day we practice," Larkland replied. "We're getting good." He mounted. He sat quiet for a long moment, as if the saddle had begun to say something only a man who sat in it every day would hear. "I grew up in a place like this. My father left because it made him feel small. I decided to come back and buy it instead." "I hope it keeps making you feel small until you learn the right size," Mavis said. He flicked the reins. They went. The dust closed over them. Jonah tightened the bolt. The ram cleared its throat and resumed. Tuck. 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 The well smoothed its hum like a horse satisfied the fence had remembered how to hold. Some victories are loud. This one was quiet and left people shaking anyway. Larkland's muscles hummed with the echo of a moment that had tilted into something better. She wanted to climb the tower and shout. She wanted to sit on the porch and weep into the collar of her shirt. She did neither. She went to the shop, pulled the box Lynn had found from under the bench, and read. The old hand had left more than maps. He'd left notes that sounded like instructions and turned out to be confessions. Turn the S lever at dusk when the frogs begin. Close at dawn when the first rooster mangles the verb. Oil the hinges with fat if you have it. tallow if you don't, sorrow if you must. The side gate is for generosity. Use it like you use your back. Never more than you can wake up with. If the county gets stupid, hide the key in the flour barrel. Larklyn laughed and cried and wiped her face on her sleeve and found the note farther down that made her stop moving entirely. If there's a girl who stands here and knows what to do without a man helping her know it, then the world is ending and beginning correctly. Teach the boys to listen to her. Shaw, who learned late. She laid the paper down on the bench like a relic. Read me the part that doesn't make me mad, Mavis said from the door, and Larklyn did. They made biscuits with the flour sitting heavy with its secret, until Mavis decided a key in a barrel had done its job and gave it a better hiding place, the pocket of a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and a winter nobody else had. In the weeks that followed, the county wore water like a new hat it was still getting used to. No one strutted. Some did walk a little differently. The co-op board installed a ledger on the fence by the blue spigot. A notebook and a pencil and a coffee can with a rock in the bottom so the wind couldn't decide to be author. People wrote their names and their reasons. People wrote jokes and recipes. People drew pictures of towers and wells with arrows labeled "Hush" and "Hurry" and "Hush" and "Hurry."
A letter arrived for Jonah in a hand he did not expect to recognize, his father's. It said simply, "Heard. If you're building, I'll send metal. If you're happy, I'll send my apology after." Jonah stood with it in the yard and watched the tower and decided to forgive before he had to. He told Larklyn about a woman he had loved in a town that had hurt too much to hold it. He did not say Sarah's name. He did not need to. Larklyn stood with him and listened and learned where the quiet in him began. A week after the refinery men left, and a day before the commissioner finally called a meeting he was going to pretend he had wanted to hold all along, Larklyn woke to the sound of the ram stuttering. Not off beat. Wrong. She was out of bed with her boots half on before her brain could mail the body instructions. In the yard, the tower's silhouette looked fine. The tanks were steady, the well breathed. The ram's mouth, though, bubbled a little foam, the color of dirty snow. The smell, sharp, chemical, almost sweet, made her mouth flood with metal. "Jonah!" she shouted, too loud for the hour. He was in the yard before his shirt remembered buttons, tasting the air like an animal that knows when the pasture's been salted. He dropped to a knee at the outlet and dipped a finger and touched it to his tongue. He spat instantly and swore with a precision that made even Mavis look impressed. "What is it?" Larklyn asked, stomach climbing her ribs. "Glycol," he said. "Coolant. Somebody fed it to the ram." "Who?" asked Len, arriving like a man ready to fight something visible. "Doesn't matter," Jonas said steady. "Kill the ram, dump the tanks, through the south ditch, not the troughs. Fast. Then we flush. We'll lose half a day." He looked at Larklyn. "We'll lose trust if we're not careful." They moved before the sun could decide. The ram clanked to sulking silence. Vance pulled the tank plugs like a priest taking a tabernacle apart. Dorothea arrived in 15 with test strips and a blast fax to the state that would have made a governor sit up because it said "not in my county." By noon, the lines ran clear, the smell was gone, and the spigots sang clean again. The community arrived in ridiculous numbers with extra jugs and patience and food and affection disguised as criticism. "You should have put a cage," old Mrs. Talbert said, and Larklyn kissed her cheek because she was right and because she brought pie. Coulter Mox sent a letter expressing horror at vandalism and offering to install cameras at cost. It felt like a finger on the back of the neck. Larklyn filed it under "Go away." The commissioners' meeting convened under a smoky sky with folding chairs and the sense of a court without robes.
Dorothea explained the aquifer with pictures that looked like a quilt and with words that made the men forget to be bored. Mavis spoke like forever does. Vance offered a financial model that even the suspicious could understand because it said, small payments, small pride, small marvels adding up. Jonah spoke once, briefly, to say he made a promise to a dead man on a different road and had finally figured out how to keep it. He told Len about a woman he had loved in a town that had hurt too much to hold it. He did not say Sarah's name. He did not need to. Len stood with him and listened and learned where the quiet in him began. A week after the refinery men left and a day before the commissioner finally called a meeting he was going to pretend he had wanted to hold all along, Larklin woke to the sound of the ram stuttering. Not off beat. Wrong. She was out of bed with her boots half on before her brain could mail the body instructions. In the yard, the tower's silhouette looked fine. The tanks were steady, the well breathed. The ram's mouth, though, bubbled a little foam the color of dirty snow. The smell, sharp, chemical, almost sweet, made her mouth flood with metal. "Jonah!" she shouted, too loud for the hour. He was in the yard before his shirt remembered buttons, tasting the air like an animal that knows when the pasture's been salted. He dropped to a knee at the outlet and dipped a finger and touched it to his tongue. He spat instantly and swore with a precision that made even Mavis look impressed. "What is it?" Larklin asked, stomach climbing her ribs. "Glycol," he said. "Coolant. Somebody fed it to the ram." "Who?" asked Len, arriving like a man ready to fight something visible. "Doesn't matter," Jonas said steady. "Kill the ram, dump the tanks through the south ditch, not the troughs. Fast. Then we flush. We'll lose half a day." He looked at Larklin. "We'll lose trust if we're not careful." They moved before the sun could decide. The ram clanked to sulking silence. Vance pulled the tank plugs like a priest taking a tabernacle apart. Dorothea arrived in 15 with test strips and a blast fax to the state that would have made a governor sit up because it said "not in my county." By noon, the lines ran clear. The smell was gone, and the spigots sang clean again. The community arrived in ridiculous numbers with extra jugs and patience and food and affection disguised as criticism. "You should have put a cage," old Mrs. Talbert said, and Larklin kissed her cheek because she was right and because she brought pie. Coulter Mox sent a letter expressing horror at vandalism and offering to install cameras at cost. It felt like a finger on the back of the neck. Larklin filed it under "Go away." The commissioners' meeting convened under a smoky sky with folding chairs and the sense of a court without robes. Dorothea explained the aquifer with pictures that looked like a quilt and with words that made the men forget to be bored. Mavis spoke like forever does. Vance offered a financial model that even the suspicious could understand because it said small payments, small pride, small marvels adding up. Jonas spoke once, briefly, to say he made a promise to a dead man on a different road and had finally figured out how to keep it. He told Len about a woman he had loved in a town that had hurt too much to hold it. He did not say Sarah's name. He did not need to. Larklin stood with him and listened and learned where the quiet in him began.
On a morning set aside by nothing but how the light happened to fall on the kitchen floor, pale, rectangular, insisting, Larklin sat with the ledger and the list Mavis kept under the ledger. She traced the names with a finger. Carla, Mrs. Reed, the Talbert kid, the man out by the grain elevator whose brother had left and taken the good bucket and whose face had uncreased when someone handed him one that didn't leak. She felt a softness in her sternum that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with finding out the county had a heart and it beat through your hands. She looked up and saw Jonah in the yard with the S-lever, giving the side gate its half-breath now that the season had changed and the frogs had been replaced by 5 a.m. crows. He looked up and caught her. The moment bent around them like tin in a good wind. "Lunch," she called, "or I'll come out there and teach you how to eat."
"Yes, ma'am," he said, and the way he said it took 3 walls off a room she had been careful not to notice around her own chest. They met on the porch. He bent like a man ready to decide something. She stepped like a woman finished letting other people decide anything for her. Their mouths found the easy truth. It tasted like sweat and coffee and the precise salt of a county forgiving itself for surviving. It did not feel like the end of work. It felt like a brace installed well. "Okay," Mavis said, after a gentlemanly interval from the kitchen doorway. "That's enough of that until the potatoes are peeled." "Boss," Jonah said, hands up, grinning with a quiet that felt sturdy. That night, Larklyn woke to the tower singing in the wind and her own heart making the same small iron sounds. She lay there in the dark and named the things she had built in the last month that were not metal. A way for men to be brave without being loud. A world in which a banker could become a cousin. A habit of asking the county instead of ordering it. She thought of the chest that had started it without knowing it would, and the iron lid under the yard that waited like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence the family had started before she knew what any of the words meant. She slept and woke to thunder. Not sky thunder, earth thunder. A low, percussive judder that made the window glass quiver and Tulia sit up in the other bed like a rabbit discovering a fence it hadn't noticed. Larklyn swung her legs out of bed. Jonah was at the door before the hall remembered to be narrow. They looked at each other, and the look said, "Count bodies, then count bolts." The yard tilted under their feet the way a boat tilts when a wave it didn't deserve finds it. The tower held. The tanks swayed and caught themselves. The well's hum leapt an octave, then returned. Far to the north, a line of blue-white tore the horizon into a menu of bad ideas. Lightning. Close. Big. "Strike on the ridge," Dorothea said, appearing coatless with her hair in a braid that might have been a rope in a previous life. "Old Cottonwood took it. Ground pulse rolled it here." She put a palm on the tank. "No leak. The ram, slow it." They did. The yard sorted itself from an earthquake into an adrenaline memory. Tulia came to the door in her nightgown and saw the adults, shoulders squared, foreheads sweating, hands steady, and decided, forever, what safety looked like. At dawn, smoke rose from the ridge. Men would ride up. They would cut the cottonwood into stories. They would take a slice for someone who needed a table that remembered something. They went about the day like people who had started not to expect to be interrupted by disaster and felt guilty and good about the surprise of being right. The co-op ledger filled with different handwriting. The well held. The tower hummed. In the late afternoon, when the light leans, a county inspector nobody recognized but everybody had seen in a diner putting syrup on eggs drove in. He had a checklist that looked like it had been printed in 1962. He checked boxes in no order Larklyn could decipher, and then, at the end, frowned in a way that meant the big box at the bottom didn't match what his day demanded. "I need to see your discharge permit for atmospheric water harvest over 500 liters per day," he said. "We have the state equivalency," Dorothea answered promptly. "Filed under drought authority, you're looking at last century's paper." He shrugged. "Last century's paper is the only kind I get paid for." Vance came out of the house with a folder he had begun to think of as another pocket. "Here," he said, pointing. "County Code Crosswalk, 7214 maps to State Drought 12. We're within community allowance." He tapped the bottom line. "Also, they named it after your aunt, Mr. Gleason, the one who used to type typing."
Gleason looked up, startled. "You knew her?" "Everybody," Mavis said, gentle. "We all learned our letters at her desk." He signed the box in a hand that looked like it missed her. He drove away at a reasonable speed for the first time all day. That night, the stars came out indecent with brightness.
Larklyn stood at the fence and breathed until her breath had all been traded fairly with the field. Jonah came with 2 mugs. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. The yard spoke their liturgy now, and they could place their lines wherever they liked. She looked at him. He looked at her. They didn't kiss this time. They had work in the morning. They had a county that needed people to ask the right questions in the right order. The love sat in their chests like a full tank, simple, waiting, patient under pressure. He set the mugs down and touched the S lever through the guard cage and made the side gate breathe just enough to let the well say goodnight to the pipes. He did it like a man turning out a child's bedroom light at the exact moment sleep wins. They went in. The tower ticked. The ram talked. The well hummed. The county turned over and went to its other side. In the morning, Mock's Resource Extraction filed for an emergency injunction in a different county. In the afternoon, the judge there threw it out with language that made the company's lawyer consider a new career in something honest like roofing. The news made everyone's phones sing. The singing made the cats scatter, because songs with relief in them always make animals nervous. "Tomorrow," Dorothea said, "we open the side gate a hand more. If she doesn't buck, we build the pipeline to the school." "Tomorrow," Jonah said. "Tomorrow," Larklyn repeated, and meant it in all the ways a person can mean it: promise, and threat, and lullaby, and draft of a constitution. At dusk, with the frogs auditioning for a part in the old hand's marginalia, with the children chanting talk in time with the ram like the world's quietest parade, with Mavis hanging laundry because even after a revolution, people need clean shirts, with Vance reading a book to Tulia about a river that learned how to curve more kindly around a town, with Len whittling a stick into maybe a handle and maybe nothing, because sometimes a man remembers he has thumbs. At that hour the county most wants to believe anything is possible, Larklyn and Jonah stood at the well and opened the iron lid to a hand and 2 fingers, slow, like surrender negotiated with a friend. The well breathed deeply, settled its shoulders, and gave without hurting itself. Water whispered down old routes toward places iron and memory had built for it. The tower agreed. The tanks agreed. The yard steadied. "Listen," Jonah said. She did. Beneath the hum and the talk and the quiet songs of moths getting it wrong about lamps, she heard something else, a far, faint throb, not machine, not water. It sounded like a drum from something underfoot that had not forgotten it was allowed to be animal. "What is that?" she whispered, not afraid, not exactly. "Distance," Dorothea said, behind them, equally hushed. "You're hearing the rest of the quilt, the other wells, the slough waking, the creek thinking about winter." The hair on her arms rushed toward her elbows like the county reaching for itself. She felt tears in her eyes without embarrassment and wiped them with a work sleeve because it had proven itself kind. "Okay," she said softly, to the yard, to the iron, to the people, to the girl in the old man's note. "Okay." She turned to Jonah and she didn't say anything. He didn't either. But later he would say that was the moment he saw the exact shape of the life they were going to have and knew it would never fail to surprise him by being harder and kinder than he deserved. In the weeks after, Clayton Purcell sold 2 bulldozers and a boat. Coulter Mox went to a different county to practice inevitability somewhere the women weren't organized. Daniel Mox resigned a board seat and moved to a city with more glyphs to hide in.
Sheriff Ellison shaved off his mustache and smiled in a kitchen for the first time since his wife died. Dorothea and Mavis built an argument that could be taught in schools about water law as if it had been written by a midwife instead of a banker. Vance bought work boots that hurt his feet less when he walked toward the right thing. Len learned to say "I'm sorry" with his hands before his mouth caught up. When it did, he said it well, and then said "I was wrong," and then said "I can help." He started showing up early. He started leaving 3 tools where he found them. He started listening to his sister before she had to repeat herself. She would love him even if he hadn't. She loved him better because he did.
They had a party on the day the school's drinking fountain turned on and ran clean. Children screamed. Teachers put their heads in their hands. Larkland stood by the spigot and handed cups as if it were communion. Jonah watched her and decided again to forgive his father without needing to hear the words. Tulia poured a little on the ground because she could, and the county took it as a libation and gave it back the next morning. The night after the party, after the last truck had rattled off, after the tower had been checked, the ram listened to, the side gate touched and tucked, Larkland climbed onto the flatbed where the chest lived when it wasn't teaching a yard how to go on. She set a hand on its battered flank and closed her eyes. She felt the seam between the small iron and the big iron, the instrument and the organ. She spoke a thank you into the metal that had outlived so much ugliness. The chest did not answer, but she didn't expect it to. It had already spoken the only word a person needs in a county like this: enough. Then there was this, a letter from the university in the city addressed to Dorothea but folded around a separate note for Larkland. Your work, it said, has implications. It invited them to speak. It offered a stipend that would have bought feed and pride both. Dorothea accepted for the both of them. Larkland said she'd come if the city promised to listen first. The city did not promise, but Dorothea promised the city, and that was enough. They went to the city the next day. They told the story in a room that had forgotten what rooms are for. They spoke without being fun. They made a professor cry without meaning to. They got an email at dawn the day after. A grant, a pilot program, an invitation to turn 6 more chests in 6 more yards into sentences a county could read when it got scared. They came home. The tower ticked them in. The ram talked amen. The well hummed welcome back. Foolish children who don't know yet that you're mine and I am yours. They slept like people who have caught up to themselves for one night. In the new winter, a freeze came that remembered the old one. They wrapped the tower in canvas like it was a foal. They bedded the pipes. The ram slowed, then refused. Then, when Jonah cooed at it in the right key, started again, like a stubborn uncle getting out of a chair. They learned where to listen with hats on. They learned the difference between enough and more. On a Sunday in January, when sunlight angled like a magician's trick through cold air, Larkland walked to the well with the S-lever in her pocket, because hope belongs near the hand even when you're just making coffee. She put her palm on the stone. She breathed. She thought of the first day, the dust-ribboned road, the laugh that had cut, the man with the creek-bed eyes, the chest in the flatbed, the bank that had learned to apologize by doing something right instead. She thought of the county's 100 little forgivenesses and its one big one. Jonah came and put a hand over hers on the stone. He did not need to say anything for the stone to write down his name. "Marry me," he said, like a brace set under a main beam. "Yes," she said, like a level finds true. They did it in the yard, because where else? They hung tin garland on the tower and tied blue fabric to the gate. Dorothea wore a dress over jeans and stood on a crate and read from the old man's notes,
because nothing in a book about love could compete with that handwriting. Vance wept openly. Mavis kissed Jonah like a mother and then threatened him like one, because love is a stern instrument. Len made a speech that began as an apology and became a vow to show up to work the rest of his life. They kissed. The tower hummed. The well hummed. The county hummed. At the reception, which is to say, at the table on the porch where people set down plates and picked up other people's babies, Coulter Mox appeared in a suit that had never forgiven anyone. He stood at the fence and watched. He did not cross. He held his hat in his hands like a man remembering a church he wasn't ready to go into. Larklyn saw him. She lifted her chin and did nothing else. He turned and left without a word and drove down the lane and out of the story for a while. He will be back later, in some other county, and there will be a woman there with a chest and a well and a lever and the same look in her eyes, and one day he will realize he kept doing it wrong and it will be too late to buy anything useful with his apology. That is one kind of ending. This story had earned another. Spring came like a person arriving at a house with both hands full, flowers and trouble. The creek behaved mostly. The ram asked for a new seal. The tower flirted with the south wind. Tulia grew taller. Vance began to date the woman who ran the clinic and laughed like she forgave him in advance. Dorothea wrote a paper everyone pretended not to understand and used the grant money to buy a lathe Mavis named after her high school boyfriend because it had more endurance than anyone liked to admit.
One evening, under a sky with ribs, Larklyn and Jonah walked the north fence. The sheep had been nosing the fringe of new grass like a salon. The fence wire pinged with the music of a place remembering to be a place. The old cottonwood on the ridge was a sculpture, now reminding the sky of its manners. They held hands like children who had gotten away with something true. At the corner, by the riser, where the new community pipeline joined the old line that once fed the Bryan place, they stopped. A small iron wheel and a valve sat there, built by a dead man's apprentice and a living woman and the man she'd chosen. Larklyn rested her fingers on it and angled it a degree. The pressure equalized. The hose down valley sighed and smiled. "Do you hear it?" she asked. "What?" "The county," she said, "when it gets the word right." He listened. He heard it. It sounded like breath not dragged. It sounded like a child at last learning to sleep through the night. It sounded like a kitchen in the morning where someone has already made the coffee and someone else is about to put the biscuits in the oven. It sounded like the hum under a well when the iron lid is at exactly the hand and 2 fingers it wants. He kissed her knuckles where they set on the wheel. "I do," he said. They walked home. The tower's silhouette cut clean against a star. The chest waited in its cradle like an old thing that had decided to be eternal by staying useful. The well hummed like a big animal at peace. At the porch, Mavis stood with her notebook. "We have a question for the board," she said, as if they weren't the board and weren't also the people at the table. "Do we fund a tower for the Angleys up by the highway? They called. He tried to sell his truck to buy a tank, and she threatened to sell him instead." "Yes," Larklyn said, "but we make him help build it." "Good," Mavis said. "I like a marriage with terms." They laughed. They ate. They slept. In the deep night, a wind from the south rattled the hedgerow and slipped under the eaves. The ram talked like a metronome for something patient. The well hummed lower than a lullaby. The county made a small sound of satisfaction the world did not hear unless it lived there. In the morning, the phone rang. It was a girl in the city with a voice like a tuning fork. She said, "We want to make a film," she said, "about the iron and the stubborn and the way you taught water to remember. We want the world to see that neighbors don't need sponsors to become utilities."
Larklin looked at Jonah. He looked at her. He shrugged. "We'll show them the tower," he said. "We'll show them the chest. We'll show them the lever." "And what you built with it," the girl said. "If that's all right." "Yes," Larklin said, and finally let herself imagine the sound across a nation of yards when 1,000 old chests, dragged out of barns and barns dragged out of memory, sigh open and agree to be useful again. She imagined the breath of 1,000 wells saying, "Present, present, present." They began that day to write down the instructions the old man had hidden in his jokes. They began to teach a class in Mavis's kitchen that smelled like biscuits and flux. They began to answer the phone like a dispatch. Work grew. Love grew around it like a fence that kept coyotes out and let deer step across when they needed to, because a person with sense builds for intention, not for enemies. On the day Tulia got her first blister from a real job, she held up her palm to Larklin with both pride and insulted astonishment. "It hurts," she said. "Then you did something worth doing," Larklin told her, and kissed the center of the blister and told it a secret the county had told her. "Pain is only proof that you picked something up." Years from now, there will be a dry season again, and men with letters will forget the last time the county taught them manners, and women will have to remind them without spilling their coffee. There will be more levers, and some will stick and some will obey. There will be more chests, and some will have nothing in them and prove useful anyway by teaching a person the difference between want and need. There will be more wells, and a few will choose not to wake, and that is their right. There will be children who climb towers and men who listen, and sometimes the reverse. But today, in this yard, in this county, the chest that looked like failure teaches the world that iron is only as stubborn as the hands that hold it. The family that laughed learns to laugh differently. The banker who collected learns to tally a new currency. The sheriff who enforced learns to stand in front of a blade. The hydrologist who measured learns to belong. The boy who broke things learns to build around the part he can't fix. The woman who carried everyone's water learns to assign buckets. And Larklin Shaw, who dared a chest, dared a yard, dared a county, dared a man, builds a life under a sky that finally believes in rain again. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.